Picture yourself standing at the entrance of a cave in South Africa. Not just any cave, but a narrow crack in the earth that drops straight down into absolute darkness. The opening is barely wide enough for your shoulders. You're wearing a helmet with a headlamp, harness gear, and you're about to descend into a space that has remained untouched for hundreds of thousands of years. This is where our story begins. September 13th, 2013. The Rising Star Cave System, part of South Africa's cradle of humankind, a vast network of limestone caves that has been giving up secrets about human evolution for nearly a century. But on this particular day, Hunter and Tucker are about to stumble onto something that will rewrite what we thought we knew about our ancient relatives. They're squeezing through passages with names that tell you everything you need to know about how difficult this journey is. Superman's Crawl, a space so tight that you have to hold one arm pressed against your body and extend the other straight overhead, like you're flying. Most people can barely fit through. You're lying on your stomach, pulling yourself forward with your fingertips, the rock pressing against your chest with every breath. If you're even slightly claustrophobic, this is where you turn back. But Hunter and Tucker keep going. Beyond Superman's Crawl, they reach something called the Dragon's Back Chamber. Imagine climbing up a razor-sharp ridge of dolomite rock that fell from the ceiling thousands of years ago. 15 meters of exposed climbing, where one wrong move could send you sliding down jagged edges in the dark. The ridge looks like the spine of some massive prehistoric creature, hence the name. Your hands are searching for holds, your feet testing each placement, the beam of your headlamp casting wild shadows that make depth perception nearly impossible. Then comes the real challenge. At the far end of the Dragon's Back Chamber, there's a vertical shaft. A crack in the rock, a fissure that drops 12 meters straight into blackness. And this crack, this chute as they call it, is at some points only 18 centimeters wide. 7 inches. Think about that. 7 inches between you and the passage forward. You have to turn sideways, exhale completely, and hope your ribcage compresses enough to squeeze through. It's not climbing at this point, it's a controlled fall, your body wedged between walls of ancient limestone, lowering yourself centimeter by centimeter into the void below. Hunter goes first. He's been caving for years, knows these systems like most people know their neighborhood streets. But this particular crack is new territory. They've been mapping unexplored sections, looking for chambers that previous cavers might have missed. And this vertical squeeze, this nightmare descent through stone, it's been here all along. Just hidden, just waiting. 12 meters down. 40 feet of vertical descent through a crack barely wider than your body. Then, suddenly, the walls pull away. Hunter's feet touch ground. He's in a chamber, maybe 30 meters underground now, and as his headlamp sweeps across the floor, he sees them. Bones. Scattered across the cave floor like someone dumped out a massive box of puzzle pieces. Not just a few bones. Hundreds of them. Maybe thousands. In every direction his light points, there are bones. Fragments of skulls, pieces of jaw, teeth, vertebrae, ribs, finger bones, toe bones, long bones from arms and legs. All of them the color of caramel, stained by minerals in the cave, some partially embedded in the sediment, others just lying on the surface, as if they'd been placed there yesterday. Tucker squeezes through the chute next, and now both of them are standing in this chamber, their headlamps creating overlapping pools of light in the darkness, and they're trying to process what they're looking at. At first, they think maybe these are recent bones. Maybe some unfortunate caver came down here decades ago and never made it back out. The bones don't look fossilized. They look almost fresh. Too fresh. There are survey pegs stuck in the sediment in one corner, marking where someone had been working. So yes, someone had been here before, but these bones, there's something wrong about them. Too many bones, too many individuals, and the shapes are strange. The skulls are small, oddly proportioned. The hand bones look almost human, but not quite. It's September 13th, and these two cavers have no idea that they're standing in what will become the most important hominin fossil site discovered in Africa in the 21st century. They take photographs. Lots of photographs. Document everything without disturbing anything, because they're professional cavers, and they know that if these bones are scientifically significant, every single detail matters. The position of each fragment, the sediment layers, the orientation of the chamber itself, all of it could tell a story. They climb back up, that terrible 12-meter squeeze through the chute, pulling themselves up through a space barely wide enough to breathe in, back across the dragon's back, through Superman's crawl, back to the surface and the light. And they take those photographs to people who might understand what they've found. First to Pedro Boshoff, a physical anthropologist, then to a man named Lee Berger. If you know anything about paleoanthropology in South Africa, you know Lee Berger. He's been searching for hominin fossils in the cradle of humankind for decades, and he's made some significant finds. But when he sees the photographs that Hunter and Tucker bring him on October 1st, he knows immediately that this is something extraordinary. The bones are hominin, not modern human, not recent. These are the remains of an ancient human relative, and they're everywhere, just scattered across the floor of this impossible-to-reach chamber like someone had been storing bodies there. Berger starts planning an excavation. But there's a problem. Actually, several problems. First, the chamber is 30 meters underground, accessible only by descending through that vertical chute that's 18 centimeters wide at its narrowest point. Most professional archaeologists and paleoanthropologists are not small enough or fit enough to squeeze through that gap. You can't widen the passage. This is a protected cave system, a UNESCO World Heritage Site. You can't dynamite your way in or bring in heavy equipment. The excavation has to be done by people who can physically fit through an opening the width of a piece of notebook paper. And third, whatever they find down there has to be documented with scientific rigor, because this could be one of the most important fossil discoveries in human evolution. So Berger does something unprecedented. He puts out a call on Facebook. He's looking for scientists, specifically people with PhDs or advanced training in paleoanthropology or archaeology, who are skinny enough and brave enough to squeeze through one of the most claustrophobic cave passages on Earth and excavate fossils in nearly impossible conditions. The ad goes viral. He receives applications from all over the world. People send in their measurements, their caving experience, their credentials. He needs people who are not just small, but also incredibly fit, because getting to the Naledi chamber, as they're now calling it, the Chamber of Stars, in the local Sotho language, is not a matter of squeezing through once. It's doing it over and over, day after day, carrying equipment down, carrying fossils up, spending hours in the dark, working in spaces so tight you can't stand up or turn around. He assembles a team of 6, all women, because the physical requirements for getting through the chute favor smaller frames. Hannah Morris, Marina Elliott, Becca Peixoto, Aliyah Gertov, Lindsay Hunter, and Ellen Foyer-Riegel. They're not just cavers, they're scientists, PhDs and doctoral candidates with specializations in everything from taphonomy to hominin morphology. And they're about to spend weeks underground in conditions that would make most people panic within minutes. The team starts calling themselves the Underground Astronauts, because that's what it feels like. They're going somewhere no one has been, somewhere humans aren't meant to go, to retrieve samples from an alien world, except this alien world is our own past, buried deep in the earth, waiting for someone small enough and brave enough to squeeze through stone and bring it back to the light. November 2013. The excavation begins. Each day, the team descends through Superman's crawl, climbs the dragon's back, and drops down through the chute into the Naledi chamber. They work in shifts because the chamber is small, and you can't have too many people working in that confined space at once. The temperature down there is constant, around 20 degrees Celsius, comfortable by cave standards. But it's the darkness that gets to you. Total, absolute darkness. Your headlamp creates a small circle of light in an ocean of black. Turn off the lamp, and you literally cannot see your hand in front of your face. This is darkness so complete that your brain starts inventing things to see. Phantom shapes and colors, because it can't process the absence of all light. And in this darkness, they start finding the bones. Not just scattered randomly, but in concentrations, clusters, where multiple individuals seem to have ended up in the same area. Some of the bones are articulated, still connected the way they would have been in life. A foot with all the bones in place. A hand with fingers still curved as if they'd been grasping something. These aren't bones that have been washed in by water or dropped from above. These are bodies. or what remains of bodies, that ended up here intact. Over the first few weeks of excavation, they recover more than 1,200 fossil elements, 1,200 pieces representing at least 15 different individuals. That's extraordinary. Most hominin fossil sites are lucky to find a few bones from a single individual. Here, they're finding multiple complete or nearly complete skeletons, infants, juveniles, adults, elderly individuals, a complete cross-section of a population. But with every bone they carefully excavate, document, and carry back up through the chute, the mystery deepens. How did these individuals get here? The chamber they're in, the Naledi chamber, there's no easy access. Not now, not in the past. Geological surveys show that the cave system has been stable for hundreds of thousands of years. The passages they used to get in, those are the only passages. These hominins would have had to come through the same terrifying route that the underground astronauts are using. Through impossibly tight spaces, in complete darkness, 30 meters below the surface. And they didn't just come once, they came multiple times. Because the bones represent individuals who died at different times. This wasn't a single catastrophic event where a group got trapped. This was repeated. Multiple trips into the deep dark, carrying something precious. Carrying the dead. But wait, let's not get ahead of ourselves. Because at this point, in November 2013, nobody knows what species these bones belong to. They're clearly hominin, clearly some kind of ancient human relative, but the anatomy is strange. The brain cases would have held brains about the size of oranges, 450 to 600 cubic centimeters, which is in the range of Australopithecus, those ancient ape-like ancestors from 3 or 4 million years ago. The teeth are small and human-like. The hands, when they start piecing together the hand bones, are almost identical to modern human hands in their wrist and palm structure, built for precision grip, for tool use. And the feet? The feet are completely adapted for upright walking, with arches and a big toe aligned with the other toes, nothing like the grasping feet of apes. This is a mosaic, a bizarre mixture of primitive and advanced features that doesn't fit any known species. They keep excavating, through December and into the new year. By the time they're done with the first phase of excavation, they have over 1,500 fossil specimens. Not bones, specimens. Some of those specimens are complete bones, others are fragments, but when you add it all up, they have more fossilized remains from a single hominin species than has ever been found at one site in Africa. And they're all from this one chamber, this one impossible-to-reach room deep in the earth. The team brings in more specialists, anatomists, to analyze the bones, geologists to understand the cave formation, taphonomists to figure out how the bones ended up where they did. Everyone who sees the fossils has the same reaction. This is something new, a species we didn't know existed. And whatever this species is, it's special, because it got into that chamber somehow, multiple individuals over what must have been a significant period of time, and they ended up there for a reason. In September 2015, 2 years after the initial discovery, Lee Berger and his team published their findings. They announced the discovery of a new species in the genus Homo. They name it Homo naledi. Naledi meaning star in Sotho, honoring the rising star cave where it was found. And they describe what they've found in detail. A species that stands about 4 feet 9 inches tall, weighs around 88 pounds, has a brain 1/3 the size of a modern human, but has hands and feet that look almost completely modern. It's like someone took an ancient Australopithecine and gave it a modern human body plan below the neck. The mosaic is unlike anything in the fossil record. But there's one thing they don't announce: the age. Because they don't know it yet. Dating fossils is complicated, especially when those fossils are from a cave system where the geological context is unusual. Without other animal fossils or clear sediment layers or volcanic ash that can be dated, figuring out when Homo naledi lived is going to take time. Some scientists look at the primitive brain size and the Australopithecine-like skull and guess that Naledi is ancient. Maybe 2 million years old, contemporary with Homo habilis and early Homo erectus, those first members of our genus. That would make sense. Small brain, primitive features, ancient age. But other scientists look at the modern hands and feet and wonder if maybe Naledi is more recent. Maybe it's a late surviving population of an ancient lineage, hanging on in southern Africa long after other early Homo species went extinct. The debate goes on for 2 years. Papers are published, conferences host heated discussions, and the underground astronauts go back into the cave because in 2013, while they were excavating the Naledi chamber, other cavers had found another concentration of fossils in a different part of the rising star system. The Naledi chamber, more than 100 meters away from Naledi, also deep underground, also impossible to access easily. And there are more Naledi fossils there, at least 3 more individuals, maybe more. Then, in May 2017, the dating results come in. And they're shocking. Homo naledi is not 2 million years old. It's not even 1 million years old. The fossils from the Naledi chamber date to somewhere between 335,000 and 236,000 years ago. Let that sink in for a moment. 300,000 years ago. That's yesterday in evolutionary terms. That's Middle Pleistocene. That's the same time period when Homo sapiens, modern humans, were just beginning to emerge in Africa, when Neanderthals were living in Europe and Asia, when the world already had large-brained, sophisticated human species making complex tools and potentially using language. And here in South Africa, there's this other human species, small-brained, primitive-looking, yet sophisticated enough to navigate deep cave systems in absolute darkness and, if the evidence is right, sophisticated enough to care for their dead. Homo naledi wasn't an ancient relic from the dawn of humanity. It was a contemporary. And that changes everything. 300,000 years ago, Earth was in the middle of an ice age. Not the peak, but deep in the cycles of glacial advance and retreat that have defined the Pleistocene epoch for the past 2.5 million years. In Europe, Neanderthals were hunting mammoths and making complex stone tools. And in the caves of South Africa, something else was living. Something that looked like it had wandered out of a much older world. Let's talk about what Homo naledi actually looked like, because understanding the anatomy is key to understanding why this species is so baffling. Imagine a skull that from the side looks vaguely human-shaped, but smaller, much smaller. The cranium is low and elongated, not tall and rounded like ours. The forehead slopes back sharply. There's a pronounced ridge above the eyes, a brow ridge, that modern humans lack. If you saw this skull without knowing what it was, you might think it came from Homo erectus, or maybe even an Australopithecine like Lucy. It's got that ancient look, that primitive architecture that screams early human ancestor from millions of years ago. But then, you measure the brain case. You calculate the volume of the space inside that skull, and you get numbers that are stunning in their smallness. 465 cubic centimeters for the females, 560 cubic centimeters for the males. For comparison, a chimpanzee brain averages about 400 cubic centimeters. A gorilla, about 500. Modern human brains average around 1,300 cubic centimeters. Homo naledi had a brain that was closer in size to an ape's than to ours, 1/3 the size of a modern human brain. Try to imagine that for a second. Your brain fills most of your skull. It's this massive, wrinkled organ that takes up space from your forehead to the back of your head. A brain the size of a large orange. Scientists use something called the encephalization quotient, or EQ, to measure how large a brain is relative to body size. Bigger animals need bigger brains just to run their bodies, so EQ adjusts for that, giving you a sense of how much brain power is left over for thinking, planning, problem solving. Modern humans have an EQ around 7. Neanderthals were similar, Homo erectus around 5, Australopithecines around 3 to 4, Homo naledi 3.75. That puts them right at the bottom of the range for the genus Homo, barely distinguishable from Australopithecines. By every metric we use to measure cognitive potential, Naledi should have been operating at the level of a very smart chimp. Should have been. Now, look at the face. This is where things get interesting. The face projects forward slightly, a bit of prognathism, meaning the jaw and nose stick out more than in modern humans, but not dramatically. Not like an Australopithecine where the whole lower face extends forward in that distinctive ape-like profile. Naledi's face is relatively flat. And the teeth are almost completely modern. Small, human-sized teeth without the massive molars and premolars that early hominins used for grinding tough plant material. The canines aren't enlarged into fangs like you see in apes. These are teeth designed for an omnivorous diet, for eating a variety of foods that don't require massive chewing forces. The jaws are slender, the jaw muscles small. This is a species that wasn't spending its days grinding through fibrous vegetation or tough roots. Move down to the body. Homo naledi stood about 143 centimeters tall. That's 4 feet 9 inches. Shorter than most modern humans, but not dramatically so. Weight estimates put them around 39 to 40 kilograms. 88 pounds. So picture someone who's short but proportioned like an adult. Not a child's proportions, but a full-grown individual who just happens to be small. The torso is interesting. The ribcage flares out at the bottom, more bell-shaped than the cylindrical torso of modern humans. The pelvis is weird too. Wide and flaring, more like an Australopithecine pelvis than a human one. This is important because pelvis shape affects how you walk, how you balance, how your muscles attach. Naledi's pelvis suggests it wasn't moving through the world quite the same way we do. But then look at the limbs. And this is where Naledi becomes truly bizarre. The legs are long, not just long relative to the small body, but structured in a way that's almost identical to modern human legs. The femur, the thigh bone, has the same angle, the same muscle attachment points, the same curvature that indicates habitual upright walking. The tibia, the shin bone, is long and straight. These are legs built for walking efficiently, on 2 feet for long distances. These are not the legs of something that spent significant time in trees. The feet are even more striking. If you put a Naledi foot next to a modern human foot, without labels, you'd have trouble telling them apart. The arch is there, that critical curved structure that acts like a spring when we walk, storing and releasing energy with each step. The big toe is aligned with the other toes, not offset like an ape's grasping foot. The ankle joint is robust, built to handle the stresses of bipedal locomotion. Every bone in the foot says this species was committed to walking upright. These feet had probably never grasped a tree branch in their lives. Now here's where it gets really strange. Look at the shoulders and arms. The shoulder blade, the scapula, it's oriented more like an Australopithecine's, more upward facing, which is an adaptation for climbing, for raising your arms above your head and pulling yourself up. The clavicle, the collarbone, is curved in a way that suggests strong shoulder muscles. These are not the shoulders of a specialized ground dweller. These are shoulders that retain the ability to climb. And then there are the hands. Oh, the hands. If the feet are surprisingly modern, the hands are a complete mind bend. The wrist bones, the carpals, are arranged almost exactly like human wrist bones. The joints are shaped for the kind of precision manipulation that humans excel at. The palm bones, the metacarpals, they're curved in just the right way to allow the hand to cup objects, to manipulate tools with accuracy. The thumb is long and muscular, with all the right attachment points for the muscles that give humans their powerful precision grip. If you're a paleoanthropologist looking at these wrist and palm bones, you're thinking, this species made tools, had to have made tools, because these are tool-making hands. But then you look at the fingers, and the fingers are long, really long, proportionally longer than human fingers, and they're curved. Every finger bone, every phalanx, has this arc to it that you only see in species that climb regularly. Chimpanzees have curved fingers. Orangutans have curved fingers. These are adaptations for hanging from branches, for moving through trees, for gripping cylindrical tree limbs, and supporting your body weight with your hands. What's even more bizarre, the curvature is more pronounced in adults than in juveniles. Usually, if you have a vestigial trait, something left over from an earlier evolutionary stage that's no longer being used, it's more prominent in young individuals and reduces with age. But Naledi's curved fingers get more curved as they age, meaning adults were climbing more than juveniles. This wasn't a leftover adaptation, this was an active behavior. So let's recap what we're looking at. Homo naledi had the brain of an Australopithecine, the feet and legs of a modern human, the shoulders of a tree climber, and hands that are simultaneously perfect for making tools and perfect for climbing. It's a mosaic, a mix and match of features that shouldn't exist together in a single species. Especially not a species living 300,000 years ago, when the general trend in human evolution was toward larger brains, more modern body proportions, and complete commitment to terrestrial life. Scientists have a term for this kind of anatomical patchwork: mosaic evolution, the idea that different parts of the body can evolve at different rates, responding to different selective pressures. Your brain might stay small while your legs become modern. Your hands might develop tool-making capabilities while retaining climbing adaptations. It makes evolutionary sense in theory, but Naledi takes it to an extreme. This species is a walking, climbing, small-brained contradiction. There's another detail that's easy to overlook but potentially crucial: sexual dimorphism. That's the difference in size and shape between males and females. In species with high sexual dimorphism, males are much larger than females, often 50% bigger or more. You see this in gorillas, in orangutans, in many extinct human ancestors. But Homo naledi shows relatively low sexual dimorphism. Males and females are similar in size, with size differences estimated at less than 20%. This is significant because low sexual dimorphism in primates usually correlates with more cooperative social structures, less male-male competition, more pair bonding. It suggests Naledi social groups weren't dominated by large, aggressive males fighting for access to females. They might have had a more egalitarian social structure, more like modern humans. The teeth tell another story. About half of the Naledi teeth examined have chips in the enamel, little fractures and breaks that suggest these individuals were regularly eating something hard and abrasive. Not bones, the chips aren't in the right places for that. Not primarily nuts, which would show different wear patterns. Possibly grit and dirt inadvertently consumed with food. Or maybe hard seeds and tough plant materials. The teeth are small, but they're tough, built to handle a varied diet that occasionally included difficult-to-process foods. Combined with the slender jaws and small chewing muscles, this suggests Naledi was probably eating high-quality foods: meat, fruits, easily digested vegetation, not spending all day grinding through tough leaves and grass. One more anatomical detail that's puzzling: the maturation rate. By examining tooth development patterns, scientists can estimate how fast an individual was growing, how long childhood lasted. In most mammals, including most primates, brain size correlates with maturation rate. Big brains take longer to develop, which means longer childhoods, later weaning, more years before reaching reproductive maturity. Chimpanzees and gorillas mature faster. Naledi's small brain should mean rapid development, reaching maturity quickly like a chimp. But the teeth tell a different story. The permanent second molars in Naledi erupt late, emerging at the same time as the premolars rather than before them. This pattern is found in modern humans but not in other fossil hominins, not even in Homo erectus or Neanderthals. It indicates a slower maturation rate, a longer developmental period. Naledi, despite its small brain, might have had a childhood growth pattern similar to ours. Extended immaturity. Years of dependency where young individuals needed to be cared for and educated by adults. That's cognitively expensive. It only makes sense if there's complex information to learn, skills to be transmitted, social relationships to navigate. Why would a small-brained species need a long childhood? Here's what keeps scientists up at night about Homo naledi. Every feature, looked at in isolation, makes sense for some environment, some lifestyle, some evolutionary pressure. Small brain means lower metabolic costs, less food needed to maintain brain tissue. Primitive shoulders and curved fingers mean you can still exploit arboreal resources, climb trees to escape predators or access food. Modern feet and legs mean efficient long-distance walking. Human-like hands mean tool manipulation, precision grip, fine motor control. Low sexual dimorphism means cooperative social groups. Late tooth eruption means extended learning period. But put it all together and it doesn't add up. Not for 300,000 years ago. Not for a world where larger brain species like early Homo sapiens and Neanderthals already existed. where sophisticated tool industries were being developed, where the evolutionary trend seemed to be clearly toward bigger brains and fully terrestrial body plans. Homo naledi looks like something from the early Pleistocene, from 2 million years ago, somehow surviving unchanged into the middle Pleistocene. A relic, a living fossil, except it wasn't unchanged, because if we found Naledi fossils from 2 million years ago alongside Homo habilis and Homo erectus, they wouldn't seem that out of place. The small brain, the primitive features, those would fit. A species that should have gone extinct or evolved into something else, but instead just kept going, kept climbing trees and walking on modern feet, kept using tool-capable hands with a brain that, by all accounts, shouldn't have been sophisticated enough to make complex tools, kept living in the shadows while bigger-brained cousins spread across Africa and beyond. And that brings us to the question that haunts every discussion of Homo naledi. What's its relationship to other human species? Is it an early diverging branch from the base of the Homo family tree? Something that split off when the genus first emerged around 2.5 million years ago and then survived in isolation for over 2 million years? That would explain the primitive features, but it wouldn't explain some of the modern characteristics. Or maybe Naledi branched off more recently, maybe from Homo erectus populations around 900,000 years ago. That would explain the mix of features better, but it would mean a species reversing some evolutionary trends, becoming smaller-brained rather than larger. Genetic analysis would solve this. DNA comparison would show us exactly where Naledi fits on the human family tree, how closely related it is to us, to Neanderthals, to Erectus, but DNA doesn't preserve well in African caves. The heat and moisture destroy organic molecules. Every attempt to extract DNA from Naledi bones has failed. Without genetics, we're left with anatomy and morphology. Measuring bones, comparing shapes, trying to construct family relationships from the shape of skulls and the curvature of finger bones. It's like trying to reconstruct a family tree when all you have are old photographs and no birth certificates. What we know for certain is this. Homo naledi existed. Multiple individuals, ranging from infants to elderly adults, lived and died in southern Africa between 335,000 and 236,000 years ago. They had bodies uniquely adapted for both arboreal and terrestrial life. They had hands capable of precision manipulation. They had brains that by our usual metrics seemed too small to support complex behavior. And somehow, they ended up deep in a cave system, 30 meters underground, in chambers so difficult to access that just getting there requires squeezing through gaps barely wider than your body. That's not random. That's not accident. That's something else entirely. And that's where this mystery really begins. Let's talk about something that makes scientists uncomfortable, the relationship between brain size and intelligence. For over a century, one of the foundational assumptions in paleoanthropology has been straightforward, almost elegant in its simplicity. Greater cognitive capacity. The story of human evolution has been told, at least in part, as the story of the expanding brain. From Australopithecines, with their 400 cubic centimeter brains, to Homo habilis, breaking the 600 mark, to Homo erectus, reaching 900, and eventually to us, Homo sapiens, topping out around 1,300 cubic centimeters. The march of progress. Bigger, better, smarter. Except Homo naledi breaks that story, takes it and smashes it against the walls of a cave deep underground in South Africa. Because here's a species with a brain that's barely larger than a chimpanzee's, a brain that puts it at the absolute bottom of the range for the genus Homo. And yet, if the evidence is correct, if the interpretations hold up, this small-brained species was doing things that we thought required large brains, complex things, sophisticated things. Things that challenge everything we thought we knew about the relationship between brain size and behavioral capability. Start with the basics. The human brain is expensive, metabolically I mean. That's an enormous investment. In evolutionary terms, you don't develop and maintain an expensive organ unless the benefits outweigh the costs. Big brains need big calories. They need high-quality food, preferably lots of fat and protein. They need stable food supplies. They need social structures that allow for the extended childhood necessary to grow and wire a large brain. The whole package only makes sense if that big brain is doing something incredibly valuable for survival and reproduction. The standard evolutionary story goes like this. As early hominins moved from forests onto savannas, they encountered new challenges: open environments with scattered resources, predators that could see you coming from a distance, competition with other species for food and territory. Success in this new environment required behavioral flexibility, tool use for processing food and defending against predators, social cooperation for hunting and sharing resources, communication for coordinating group activities. All of these behaviors benefit from increased cognitive power. So, natural selection favored larger brains. Individuals with bigger brains were better problem solvers, better social navigators, better at innovation and adaptation. They survived better, reproduced more successfully, and passed on genes for larger brains to the next generation. Over millions of years, hominin brains tripled in size. Australopithecines gave way to early Homo with modestly increased brain size. Homo erectus pushed brain size up significantly. Archaic humans like Homo heidelbergensis expanded it further. And finally, Neanderthals and Homo sapiens reached brain sizes larger than any hominin had ever achieved. Bigger brains, more complex tools, more sophisticated social structures, more advanced symbolic thought. The correlation seemed clear. Brain size drives behavioral complexity. Then we find Homo naledi. And the correlation starts looking less clear, because Naledi's brain is tiny, 465 to 610 cubic centimeters depending on the individual. That's at the low end of Homo habilis, smaller than any Homo erectus, dramatically smaller than any archaic or modern human. The encephalization quotient, remember, is 3.75. That's barely distinguishing it from Australopithecines. By every metric we use, Naledi should have been cognitively limited, should have been making simple tools at best, should have been living in small, unstructured groups, should have been prey for larger predators rather than sophisticated hunters. But here's where it gets interesting. In 2018, a team of researchers led by paleoanthropologist John Hawkes published a detailed analysis of Homo naledi's brain structure, not just size, but shape, organization, the folding patterns on the brain's surface. They did this by examining endocasts, which are basically impressions that the brain leaves on the inside of the skull. When an organism dies and the brain decays, sometimes sediment fills the skull and hardens, preserving a cast of what the brain looked like. Natural endocasts are rare, but the Naledi skulls were in good enough condition that researchers could also make virtual endocasts using CT scanning. They could see the grooves and ridges where the brain had pressed against the inside of the skull. And what they saw was surprising. The brain was small, yes, about 1/3 the size of a modern human brain, but the structure, the organization, that looked remarkably human. Specifically, the frontal lobe. This is the part of the brain right behind your forehead, the region involved in planning, decision-making, impulse control, social behavior, and working memory. In great apes like chimpanzees and gorillas, you can see a groove on the brain called the fronto-orbital sulcus. It's a visible dividing line between different regions of the frontal lobe. In humans and other Homo species, that groove is mostly absent. Why? Because two neighboring areas of our frontal lobe have expanded so much that they've partially covered over another region called the insula, obscuring that groove. When researchers looked at Homo naledi's brain structure, they found the human pattern. No fronto-orbital sulcus. The frontal lobe organization looked like Homo, not like Australopithecus or apes. Despite being tiny, Naledi's brain had reorganized itself along human lines. The same pattern shows up in Homo habilis, Homo erectus, even in Homo floresiensis, that other small-brained human species from Indonesia. Brain size varies enormously across Homo species, but frontal lobe organization is remarkably consistent. This suggests that something important changed at the base of our genus, some reorganization of brain structure that made Homo cognitively different from earlier hominins, even before brains started getting dramatically larger. But what does frontal lobe organization actually mean for behavior? That's harder to say. In modern humans, damage to the frontal lobe causes specific deficits. Problems with planning ahead, difficulty inhibiting inappropriate responses, trouble with complex social situations. But we can't just assume that Naledi's frontal lobe worked the same way ours does. The total number of neurons matters. The connections between different brain regions matter. Having a human-like frontal lobe organization in a brain 1/3 the size might not produce human-like cognition. Then there's another detail from the brain analysis: asymmetry. The right and left hemispheres are slightly different sizes, with the right frontal lobe often extending forward more than the left, and the left occipital lobe in the back extending farther back than the right. This asymmetry, called petalia, is thought to be related to handedness and possibly to language, since language processing tends to be lateralized to the left hemisphere in most humans. Greater brain asymmetry is usually associated with larger brains in the Homo lineage. The Naledi endocasts show evidence of asymmetry. One fragment from the occipital region suggests the human pattern of petalia. This is unexpected in such a small brain. Asymmetry should be something that develops as brains get larger and more specialized. But here it is in Naledi, a hint of the same lateralization that shows up in our much larger brains. What was Naledi's brain doing that required this kind of specialization? Here's another piece of the puzzle: the hands. We talked about Naledi's hands in the last chapter, but it's worth revisiting them here because they're directly relevant to cognition. The wrist and thumb structure is almost identical to modern humans. The precision grip, the ability to manipulate small objects with fine motor control. All the anatomical prerequisites are there. Tool use, especially the kind of complex tool manufacture that requires planning and sequential operations that's closely linked to brain evolution. You need a sophisticated brain to coordinate the complex movements involved in making stone tools, and you need tool-capable hands to express that cognitive sophistication. Homo naledi had the hands, but did it have the cognition to use them? No stone tools have been found in association with Naledi fossils. None in the Dinaledi chamber. None in the Lesedi chamber. None anywhere in the Rising Star cave system. This absence is strange. If Naledi had the hand anatomy for tool use and lived in a time period when multiple other human species were making sophisticated stone tools, why aren't there any Naledi tools? 3 possibilities. 1. Naledi didn't make stone tools despite having hands capable of it. 2. Naledi made tools but not in caves, and the tools exist somewhere in the landscape but haven't been found yet. 3. Naledi made tools from organic materials, wood or bone or plant fibers, none of which preserve in the African fossil record. The second and third options seem more likely given the hand anatomy. But the absence of stone tools is still puzzling. Stone tools are virtually indestructible. They last millions of years. Archaeological sites across Africa from this time period are full of stone tools. If Naledi was making them, we should be finding them. Unless Naledi was doing something different, using materials that decompose, or living in environments where stone tool sites don't form or haven't been discovered. Now let's address the elephant in the room, or rather, the elephant deep in a cave system. If the burial hypothesis is correct, if Homo naledi was really deliberately placing bodies in the Dinaledi chamber, that's behavioral complexity of a very high order. Burial behavior implies several cognitive prerequisites. First, awareness of death as a distinct state. Understanding that dead individuals are different from living ones and won't wake up. Second, emotional responses to death that motivate special treatment of bodies. Grief, respect, fear of contamination, something that makes you want to do something with the body rather than just leaving it where it falls. If you're going to carry bodies into a cave system, especially one as difficult to access as Rising Star, you need to plan the journey, coordinate with other group members, and execute complex navigational tasks in darkness. Fourth, and this is crucial, you need symbolic thought, the ability to understand that the dead body represents something beyond just dead flesh, that it has meaning within your social group, that the place where you deposit it has significance. Funerary behavior is fundamentally symbolic. It's doing something purely because of what it means, not because of any immediate practical benefit. Burying the dead doesn't help you get food or avoid predators or stay warm. It only makes sense in a symbolic, cultural framework. All of these cognitive capabilities, traditionally we've assumed they require large brains. We've assumed that symbolic thought, in particular, is a product of the human cognitive revolution, something that emerged with large-brained Homo sapiens within the last 100,000 years or so. Neanderthals probably had it too. Their brains were as large as ours. Maybe Homo heidelbergensis, the common ancestor of humans and Neanderthals, showed early signs of it. But Homo naledi, with its 465 cubic centimeter brain, that challenges the whole model. Some researchers argue that the burial hypothesis must be wrong precisely because Naledi's brain is too small. The cognitive demands of deliberate burial are simply beyond what a brain that size can support. Therefore, the Naledi fossils got into the cave through some other mechanism. Natural processes we don't fully understand yet. Death trap scenarios. Water transport, something that doesn't require complex cognition. This is a reasonable position. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and claiming that a small-brained hominin engaged in funerary behavior is extraordinary. But other researchers look at the evidence differently. They point out that brain size and cognitive capability might not be as tightly correlated as we've assumed. That organization matters more than volume. That Naledi's human-like brain structure, despite small size, might have been sufficient for complex behaviors. They point to the feet, showing commitment to long-distance bipedalism, which requires navigational skills and spatial memory. They point to the low sexual dimorphism, suggesting cooperative social structures. They point to the extended maturation period, visible in tooth development, suggesting a long learning period where complex information could be transmitted from adults to juveniles. Put it all together, and maybe, just maybe, Homo naledi was more cognitively sophisticated than its brain size would suggest. Maybe the relationship between brain size and behavior is more complicated than we thought. Maybe there are multiple pathways to behavioral complexity. Humans got there with enormous brains. Naledi might have gotten partway there with a small but well-organized brain. Not human-level cognition, certainly, but something beyond what we'd expect from a chimpanzee or gorilla, something in between. There's a precedent for this. Homo floresiensis, the so-called hobbit species from Indonesia, also had a remarkably small brain. About 400 cubic centimeters, even smaller than Naledi. Yet floresiensis was making sophisticated stone tools, living on an island that required water crossing to reach, hunting dwarf elephants using coordinated group strategies. That's not simple behavior. That requires planning, cooperation, tool manufacture, and ecological knowledge, all with a brain the size of a chimpanzee's. Floresiensis showed us that extreme brain reduction doesn't necessarily mean cognitive collapse. Species can remain behaviorally sophisticated while losing brain size, probably as an adaptation to resource-limited island environments. Could something similar have happened with Naledi? Not on an island, but perhaps in a challenging environment where large brains were too metabolically expensive, where success depended on behavioral flexibility and social cooperation rather than individual cognitive horsepower, where being small and efficient was more advantageous than being large-brained. We don't know what ecological niche Naledi occupied, what it ate, where it lived day to day, what challenges it faced. The fossil evidence comes entirely from caves. We have no idea what Naledi life looked like outside those dark underground chambers. Here's what we do know. The human brain is not just larger than other primate brains. It's different in organization, in connectivity, in the ratio of different cell types, in the efficiency of neural processing. Some of these differences show up in brain structure that can be seen in endocasts. The expanded frontal lobe, the asymmetry, the particular folding patterns. Homo naledi shows some of these structural features. Not all of them, and not to the same degree as in large-brained humans, but enough to suggest its brain was organized along Homo lines rather than Australopithecine or ape lines. What could you do with a brain organized like a human's, but only 1/3 the size? Maybe tool use and social cooperation and even rudimentary symbolic thought. Maybe you could navigate complex cave systems in darkness using spatial memory and problem solving. Maybe you could coordinate with group members to transport bodies deep underground. Maybe you could develop traditions and cultural practices that were passed down through generations, not at human levels of complexity, but beyond what chimpanzees or gorillas can do. Something new, something we didn't expect to find in the fossil record. Or maybe we're overestimating what Naledi could do. Maybe the burial hypothesis is wrong, and we're building elaborate cognitive castles on shaky foundations. Maybe Naledi was just a small-brained hominin doing simple small-brained hominin things, and the fossils ended up in caves through prosaic natural processes. Maybe the human-like brain structure is an evolutionary vestige from a larger-brained ancestor, retained even as brain size decreased. Maybe we're seeing patterns where there are only random accidents. The truth is, we don't know. We can't know for certain what was going on inside those small heads. We can measure brain cases and map folding patterns and compare structures across species, but we can't observe behavior. We can't test cognitive capabilities. All we have are bones and stones and the stories we try to construct from them. And those stories, we're learning, might be more complicated than we thought. What Homo Naledi teaches us, regardless of how the burial debate resolves, is that the relationship between brain size and behavior is not simple. That our genus, Homo, might have been more diverse, more experimentally variable than we've appreciated. That there might have been multiple ways of being human, multiple combinations of anatomy and cognition that allowed different species to survive in different environments. We spent the 20th century building a narrative of human evolution centered on brain expansion. From small-brained Australopithecines to large-brained us, with each step up in cranial capacity, bringing new cognitive powers and behavioral capabilities, Homo Naledi forces us to complicate that narrative, to acknowledge that brain size is only part of the story, that organization matters, that ecological context matters, that different species might have solved survival challenges in different ways, with different combinations of anatomy, cognition, and behavior. Maybe the real question isn't whether Naledi's brain was too small for complex behavior. Maybe the question is what we mean by complex behavior in the first place. Is deliberate burial complex? Yes, by our standards. But maybe there are simpler versions of caching the dead, simpler motivations that don't require full symbolic thought. Maybe there's a spectrum of mortuary behavior, and Naledi was somewhere on that spectrum, not at the human end, but beyond the nothing end. Maybe cognition itself is more modular than we thought. You can be sophisticated in some domains and simple in others, good at spatial navigation but poor at abstract reasoning, excellent at social cooperation but limited in language-like communication. We've been trying to rank species on a single cognitive ladder, smarter or dumber, more advanced or more primitive, but evolution doesn't work that way. It creates specialists. It creates species adapted for particular niches, with cognitive toolkits suited for particular challenges. Homo Naledi had a toolkit. Small brain, but human-organized. Climbing abilities, but committed bipedalism. Tool-capable hands, but no stone tools that we've found. Extended childhood, but modest brain size. It's a unique combination. Not better or worse than other human species, just different, adapted for something we don't fully understand yet. And here's the thing that should make us humble. We're one species trying to understand another species from fragments of evidence 300,000 years old. We're looking at bone shapes and trying to infer thoughts, behaviors, social structures, entire ways of life. We're remarkably good at this. Paleoanthropology as a field has built sophisticated methods for extracting information from fossils. But there are limits. We can see the hardware, the brain case, the skull, the bones. We can't see the software, the neural wiring, the cognitive processes, the subjective experience of being Homo Naledi. Maybe Naledi looked out at the world and understood it in ways we can't imagine. Maybe the small brain processed information differently, more efficiently in some ways, less capable in others. Maybe Naledi had capabilities we don't recognize because we're looking for human-like intelligence and missing Naledi-like intelligence. Or maybe Naledi was just a small-brained hominin doing the best it could with limited cognitive resources And we're reading too much into the evidence because we want the story to be more interesting than it is. The brain that shouldn't work. That's what Homo naledi has. A brain that by all our models and metrics should have limited this species to simple, ape-like behaviors. And yet here we are, decades into studying this species, and we can't definitively say what it was capable of. Can't rule out tool use, can't rule out symbolic behavior, can't rule out mortuary practices. The little brain keeps surprising us, keeps refusing to fit into the categories we've built. And maybe that's the point. Maybe evolution is messier and more creative than our categories allow. Maybe the story of human origins is full of species like Naledi, strange combinations of traits doing unexpected things, most of which went extinct without leaving traces we can interpret centuries later. One thing is certain. Homo naledi has forced paleoanthropology to reconsider some fundamental assumptions. Brain size equals intelligence. That's looking less certain now. Linear progress in human evolution. That's definitely wrong. The uniqueness of Homo sapiens. That's more complicated than we thought. We're not the only species that walked on two legs with human-like feet. We're not the only species with hands capable of fine manipulation. We might not even be the only species that cared for our dead in some fashion. We're still unique, certainly, but perhaps not as uniquely unique as we once believed. And Homo naledi, with its impossible combination of features, is the species forcing us to confront that reality. 30 meters below the surface of South Africa, in complete and absolute darkness, there are bones. Hundreds of bones. Thousands of bones. The remains of at least 18 Homo naledi individuals scattered across multiple chambers of the Rising Star cave system. And here's the question that has consumed researchers for over a decade. How did they get there? This isn't a trivial question. This is the central mystery of Homo naledi, because the distribution and condition of these fossils defies every standard explanation for how animal remains accumulate in caves. The fossils aren't where they should be if natural processes put them there. And if natural processes didn't put them there, then something else did. Something that requires rethinking what we know about human evolution and the origins of complex behavior. Let's start with the geography. The Rising Star cave system is extensive, mapped over hundreds of meters, with multiple chambers and passages connecting in a three-dimensional maze of limestone carved by water over millions of years. The system has one main entrance that cavers have been using since the 1960s. From that entrance, you navigate through a series of chambers and crawls, some easy, some challenging, until you reach the areas where Naledi fossils have been found. And here's the critical detail. Getting to those areas is not easy. It's not even moderately difficult. It's borderline impossible. The primary route to the Naledi chamber, where the majority of Naledi fossils were found, requires first passing through Superman's crawl, a passage so narrow you have to extend one arm overhead and press the other against your body just to fit through. Your chest compresses with every breath. If you panic and inhale deeply, you can wedge yourself stuck. Then you climb Dragon's Back, a 15-meter ascent up a narrow ridge of sharp dolomite that fell from the ceiling long ago. Ancient Naledi would have been making this climb in complete darkness, feeling their way along jagged rock. After Dragon's Back comes the chute. This is where things get truly claustrophobic. The chute is a vertical fissure dropping 12 meters, roughly 40 feet, straight down. At its narrowest point, the gap is 18 centimeters wide, 7 inches. Most adult humans cannot fit through an 18-centimeter gap. The researchers who excavated the Naledi chamber had to be specifically selected for small body size. Some of them could barely squeeze through, even after exhaling completely. Going down is a controlled descent. Lowering yourself through a vertical crack where your body is wedged between walls of stone. Coming back up means climbing the same vertical crack. There are no ledges, no convenient handholds. You're shimming up through rock that's gripping your torso, pulling yourself up through compression and friction. At the bottom of the chute, you emerge into the hill antechamber, a small space that opens into the larger Naledi chamber. Both chambers contain Naledi fossils, multiple individuals in each location, and both chambers are at the end of this obstacle course. 30 meters underground, accessible only by passing through gaps that most people physically cannot fit through. In absolute darkness, with no margin for error, because a fall or a wrong move could leave you injured and trapped in a place where rescue would be nearly impossible. Here's what makes this significant. The Naledi chamber was not easy to access 300,000 years ago either. Geological analysis of the cave system shows it's been stable for hundreds of thousands of years. The passages haven't changed much. The chute has always been a chute. Dragon's Back has been there for at least as long as the Naledi fossils. There's no evidence of a different entrance that has since collapsed or been filled with sediment. The route modern cavers use is the route that's been there for the entire time period we're interested in. Which means Homo Naledi would have had to navigate the same terrifying path to get bodies into these chambers. Could there have been another way in? This was one of the first questions researchers investigated. Maybe there was a more accessible entrance that has since been blocked. Maybe the fossils fell in from above through a vertical shaft that's now sealed. The team conducted extensive mapping of the surface above the Naledi chamber, looking for any signs of openings, for collapsed features, for anything that might indicate a different route. They found nothing. No large fractures in the rock above the chamber. No evidence of a roof collapse that would have created and then sealed a shaft. The ceiling of the Naledi chamber is intact, formed by solid layers of dolomite limestone that have been there for millions of years. They also searched inside the cave system for alternative routes. Professional cavers spent weeks exploring every passage, every tight squeeze, every vertical crack, looking for ways to reach the Naledi chamber besides the chute. The geometry of the cave simply doesn't allow it. The Naledi chamber is isolated, accessible only through that one terrible route. If bodies were going to get into that chamber, they had to come through the chute. Okay, so maybe the bodies didn't travel as intact corpses. Maybe they were already decomposed, and the bones were somehow transported into the cave. Water is a common mechanism for moving bones in caves. Flash flooding can wash remains through cave systems, depositing them in quiet chambers where water flow slows down. But here's the problem with the water transport hypothesis. The Naledi chamber shows no evidence of significant water flow. The sediments are fine-grained clays and silts that form in still water or through slow accumulation, not the cobbles and coarse sands you'd expect from flowing water. There are no aligned bones, no sorting by size or density that flowing water creates. The chamber's configuration doesn't suggest it was ever a water trap where floodwaters pooled and deposited suspended materials. More importantly, detailed analysis of the bones themselves shows they arrived intact. There are articulated skeletal elements, bones still connected as they would have been in life. A nearly complete foot with all the small bones in correct anatomical position. Hands with finger bones preserved in association. Partial skulls with mandibles still attached. Sequences of vertebrae in proper order. This doesn't happen when water transports bones. Water flow scatters skeletal elements, separates joints, sorts bones by size and shape. The very fact that researchers found articulated remains proves the bodies were intact when they entered the chamber. Flesh still holding bones together. Connective tissue still maintaining skeletal architecture. What about predators? Maybe carnivores dragged Naledi bodies or body parts into the cave. Caves are attractive den sites for predators. Leopards and hyenas in Africa regularly use caves as shelter and as food storage locations. A predator could have killed Naledi individuals and dragged them underground to cache for later consumption. Except the evidence doesn't support this either. Carnivore accumulated bone assemblages have distinctive signatures. Tooth marks where predators gripped and chewed bones. Specific patterns of skeletal element representation because predators preferentially consume certain body parts and leave others. Damage to articular ends of long bones where carnivores crunch through to access marrow. And most obviously, the presence of predator remains. If a cave was used by carnivores as a den or food cache, you find carnivore bones mixed in with prey bones. Predators die too, and their remains accumulate in the places they frequent. The Naledi chamber has none of this. No tooth marks on bones, no carnivore damage patterns, no preferential skeletal representation, and critically, no carnivore remains. Out of over 1,500 fossil elements recovered from the chamber, only hominin bones. No hyena fossils. No leopard fossils. No bones from any other large mammals that could have served as prey or predators. There are a few bird bones and some rodent remains, but these are minimal and clearly not associated with the main fossil deposit. The chamber contains one species of large mammal, Homo naledi. That's it. Could the individuals have wandered into the cave and gotten trapped? Maybe the Naledi chamber was a death trap, a place where animals could enter but couldn't escape, leading to accumulation of bodies over time. Vertical shafts where animals fall in and can't climb back out. Narrow passages where animals get wedged and stuck. But the Naledi chamber doesn't fit this pattern either. For one thing, multiple chambers contain Naledi remains. The Naledi chamber and the Naledi chamber, over 100 meters apart, both have concentrations of fossils. A death trap typically accumulates remains in one location. If you can walk into one chamber but not escape, you don't then also walk into a completely separate chamber and get trapped there too. Second, the age range is wrong for a death trap. The fossils represent individuals from infants to elderly adults. Death traps select for specific age classes and body sizes. The very young who fall in accidentally, the very old or infirm who can't climb out. You don't get representative population samples including healthy prime-age adults. Yet the Naledi assemblage includes juveniles, young adults, mature adults, all age categories. This looks like a population, not a selection of individuals who made fatal mistakes. Third, if the chamber were a trap, we'd expect to find evidence of trauma. The Naledi bones show none of this. No systematic trauma patterns. No evidence of injury related to entrapment. The individuals appear to have been dead before entering the chamber, or died shortly after entering without signs of prolonged suffering. So natural processes don't explain the fossils. Water didn't wash them in. Predators didn't drag them in. The chamber wasn't a death trap. Each hypothesis fails on multiple lines of evidence, which leaves researchers with a problem. If natural processes can't account for the bones, then something unnatural, or at least unusual, must have happened. Something behavioral, something intentional. Here's where the evidence gets really interesting. The fossils aren't distributed randomly across the chamber floors. They're clustered, concentrated in specific areas. Some clusters show high densities of bones from multiple individuals mixed together. Other areas of the chambers have few or no bones. This patterning suggests deliberate placement, bodies or body parts positioned in particular locations, rather than scattered randomly by natural processes. In the hill antechamber, right at the base of the chute, there's a concentration of fossils that includes at least one relatively complete individual. Articulated foot bones, associated leg bones, vertebral elements in sequence. This individual was placed near the entry point to the deeper cave system, not dropped down the chute, because the horizontal component of the passage means nothing dropped from above would land in that location. Further into the Naledi chamber, there are more concentrations, some in shallow depressions in the cave floor, some against the chamber walls. The most famous cluster is called the puzzle box, a dense accumulation of bones from multiple individuals that excavators had to remove in plaster blocks because the elements were too jumbled and too important to risk separating on site. Dozens of bones from at least 3 individuals, all mixed together in a space about the size of a large cardboard box. Again, not a natural accumulation, not water sorted, not carnivore damaged. Just bones, lots of bones, carefully excavated and analysed by researchers trying to figure out how they got there. The Naledi chamber tells a similar story. Over 100 meters from Naledi, through different passages, accessible by a different route but equally difficult. At least 3 more individuals, adults and a juvenile, found in another remote, difficult to access location. The chance of 2 separate death traps in the same cave system, both accumulating only Naledi fossils with no other fauna, both showing evidence of articulated remains, is astronomically small. The pattern suggests whatever happened in Naledi also happened in Naledi. Multiple chambers, multiple events, but the same result. Naledi bodies ending up in deep, dark places. There's one more detail that's crucial: the darkness. This cannot be overstated. The Naledi chamber and the Naledi chamber are in total darkness. Not dim light, not twilight. Absolute, complete, unrelenting darkness. No natural light penetrates from the surface. There's no bioluminescence from cave-dwelling organisms. It's darkness so profound that your eyes can't adjust to it because there's literally nothing to see. Hold your hand 1 inch from your face and you can't see it. This is the darkness of deep ocean trenches, of the inside of a sealed tomb. And somewhere around 300,000 years ago, Homo naledi was navigating through this darkness. Squeezing through passages, climbing over obstacles, descending vertical shafts, all in the complete absence of light. How? Fire is the obvious answer. Controlled use of fire for illumination. Torches made from wood or bundled grasses, maybe coated with resin or fat to burn longer. Fire would allow navigation of the cave system. Would allow you to see where you were going, where to place your hands and feet, how to avoid falling or getting stuck. Fire would make the impossible merely incredibly difficult. But here's the problem. No definitive evidence of fire has been found in the Naledi chambers. No burned bone, no charcoal deposits, no smoke staining on the cave walls. The research team has reported traces that might indicate fire use, residues that could be from burning organic materials, but nothing conclusive. Nothing that definitively proves Naledi was using torches. Could they have navigated in darkness? This seems even more implausible. Humans have abysmal spatial orientation in complete darkness. We're visual creatures. Strip away light and we get disoriented within seconds. The idea of climbing through a complex cave system without vision, without ever having seen the route, is nearly impossible to imagine. Yet some cave-adapted animals do navigate in darkness using other senses. Bats use echolocation. Cave-dwelling fish use pressure sensing. Could Naledi have had enhanced non-visual navigation abilities? There's no anatomical evidence for this. The inner ear structure is normal. The brain doesn't show enlargement of regions associated with heightened hearing or tactile sensing. If Naledi was navigating in darkness, it was doing so with the standard mammalian sensory toolkit, which makes the feat even more remarkable. Or maybe the journey was rare enough that the risks were acceptable. Maybe getting to the chambers was dangerous and difficult, and Naledi accepted casualties in the process. Maybe some individuals fell during the climb, got wedged in the chute, died from hypothermia or exhaustion. Maybe the bones in the chambers include not just the intended deposits, but also the unlucky ones who didn't survive the journey. This would explain why multiple individuals ended up in the same challenging locations. Some were brought deliberately. Others became trapped during the bringing. Except the bones don't support this either. If individuals were dying during difficult cave navigation, we'd expect a different distribution. Bodies wedged in tight passages, remains in the chute itself. Skeletons spread along the route from the entrance to the deep chambers. Instead, the fossils are concentrated in the terminal chambers, the ends of the journey, where you'd expect remains to be if someone or something was carrying them to specific destination points. Every line of evidence points the same direction. Bodies got into these chambers through behavior, intentional, repeated behavior that involved navigating one of the most challenging underground routes in southern Africa, in darkness or near darkness, depositing them in specific locations, and then leaving, climbing back up through the chute, back over Dragon's Back, back through Superman's crawl, returning to the surface and the light. Doing this not once but multiple times, for multiple individuals, creating accumulations of bodies that would remain undisturbed for 300,000 years, until two cavers decided to squeeze through a crack that nobody had fully explored before. This is the mystery at the heart of Homo naledi, not just how these individuals died, but how their bodies ended up 30 meters underground in absolute darkness, in chambers that can barely be accessed by modern humans with safety equipment and artificial light. And more fundamentally, why? Why would any species, especially one with a brain the size of a chimpanzee's, go to such extraordinary lengths to place dead bodies in one of the most inaccessible locations imaginable? What possible evolutionary advantage could there be? What behavior, what emotion, what cognitive process would drive this? That's what we need to explore next, because the how is mysterious enough. But the why, that's where things get truly controversial. In June 2023, Lee Berger made an announcement that sent shockwaves through the scientific community and captured headlines around the world. His team had found evidence, he claimed, that Homo Naledi deliberately buried their dead, not just placed bodies in caves, buried them, dug pits in the cave floor, positioned bodies in those pits, and filled the pits back in with sediment. If true, this would be the earliest known burial behavior in the hominin fossil record by more than 100,000 years, and it would be the first evidence of burial by a non-human species ever. The implications were staggering. Burial behavior has long been considered a hallmark of behavioral modernity, a sign of symbolic thinking, of culture, of the cognitive sophistication that supposedly makes humans unique. We bury our dead because death means something to us, because we believe the body deserves respect, because we have concepts of contamination, or afterlife, or social memory, because we're cognitively complex enough to engage in behaviors that serve symbolic rather than practical functions. Neanderthals buried their dead, and we've spent decades debating what that means about their cognitive abilities and cultural sophistication. But Neanderthals had brains as large as ours. Homo Naledi had brains 1/3 that size. If Naledi was burying the dead, it would mean symbolic behavior emerged much earlier in human evolution than anyone suspected. And it would mean brain size is even less important for complex behavior than we'd realized. The burial hypothesis didn't come out of nowhere. It had been building for years, ever since the first Naledi fossils were discovered. The very fact that bodies ended up in such inaccessible locations suggested intentional behavior. Body disposal, at minimum. Caching the dead in a remote place. But was it burial? That's a much more specific claim, with much higher evidentiary requirements, and when Berger and his team published their findings, the evidence they presented was detailed, extensive, and immediately controversial. Let's start with what they found. Between 2017 and 2022, the research team conducted new excavations in the Naledi subsystem, focusing on both the hill antechamber and deeper parts of the Naledi chamber. They weren't just recovering fossils anymore, they were conducting systematic geological analysis of the sediments, the cave floor, the context in which bones were found, and they identified features, specific locations where the cave floor had been disturbed, where sediment layers were interrupted, where depressions had been excavated and then filled back in. Feature 1 is in the hill antechamber, near the base of the chute. It's a shallow depression, roughly oval in shape, cut into the cave floor. The edges of this depression are defined, showing clear boundaries between the fill inside the feature and the undisturbed sediment surrounding it. Inside the depression, the research team found articulated skeletal remains. A nearly complete individual, adult or late juvenile. Legs drawn up, arms positioned near the torso. The kind of positioning you see in intentional burials across many cultures. Not the random sprawl of a body that fell or was dumped, but a deliberate arrangement. Feature 2 is further into the Naledi chamber. Another shallow depression, this one containing a concentration of bones from at least one individual, possibly more. Again, the sediments inside the feature are different from the surrounding cave floor. Different grain size, different compaction, different mineral composition, as if the depression was excavated, then filled with sediment that came from elsewhere in the cave or was mixed during the filling process. Feature 3 is in a location the team calls the hill antechamber cavity. More bones, more evidence of disturbance to the cave floor, more indications that sediment had been moved and repositioned. In total, the research team identified at least 3 features that they interpreted as burial pits, locations where the stratigraphy, the layer cake of sediment that builds up on cave floors over thousands of years, had been interrupted by excavation and refilling. To support these interpretations, the team conducted sophisticated sediment analysis. They used a technique called X-ray fluorescence, or XRF, which bombards soil samples with X-rays and analyzes the spectrum of radiation emitted back. Different chemical elements emit different wavelengths, so XRF gives you a detailed chemical fingerprint of soil composition. If sediment has been dug up and mixed, its chemical composition should be more heterogeneous, more variable, than undisturbed sediment. The XRF results showed exactly this pattern. Inside the proposed burial features, chemical variability was high. Outside the features, variability was low. The sediments had been mixed. They also used particle size distribution analysis, or PSD, examining the size of individual grains in the sediment. Natural cave sediments tend to have consistent grain sizes within a given layer because they're deposited by consistent processes. But if you dig up sediment and refill a pit, you mix grains from different layers, creating a jumble of particle sizes. Again, the results supported the burial hypothesis. Inside the features, particle size distribution was chaotic. Outside, it was uniform. Something had disturbed those sediments in ways that don't happen naturally. Beyond the sediment analysis, there was the positioning of the bones. In Feature 1, the skeleton isn't just lying on the cave floor, it's in a depression. And it's articulated, meaning the bones are still connected as they would be in life. This only happens if the body was buried relatively soon after death, before soft tissues fully decomposed and bones separated. If you dump a body on the surface and leave it, scavengers and decomposition will scatter the bones. But if you bury a body, cover it with sediment, protect it from disturbance, articulation can be preserved. The Feature 1 skeleton shows preservation consistent with burial. There's another detail. In one of the features, associated with articulated remains, the excavation team found a single stone tool, a deliberately shaped piece of rock, not part of the natural geology of the cave. This stone had been worked, showing intentional modification, and it was positioned near the skeletal remains, as if it had been placed there deliberately. A grave good, an object buried with the body. This is culturally significant if true. Grave goods indicate symbolic thinking. The idea that the dead need possessions, or that objects have meaning beyond their practical function. Cultures around the world have buried grave goods with their dead for tens of thousands of years. If Naledi was doing this 300,000 years ago, it's not just burial, it's funerary behavior, cultural practice. The team's argument is that all of these lines of evidence converge. The depressions that don't follow the natural topography of the cave floor, the mixed sediments indicating excavation and refilling, the articulated skeletons positioned in flexed postures, the grave good, the repeated pattern across multiple features in multiple chambers. Taken together, they argue, this is burial. Intentional, deliberate, culturally patterned burial behavior. And if the only hominin species in these caves is Homo naledi, then Naledi must be responsible. Now, before we go further, it's important to note something. When these findings were first announced in June 2023, they were published as preprints, papers posted online before undergoing formal peer review. This is increasingly common in science. It allows rapid dissemination of findings, especially important or controversial ones. But it also means the work hasn't yet been vetted by independent experts. The team did eventually submit revised versions for peer review, but the initial announcement, including a Netflix documentary called Cave of Bones, came before that review process was complete. This timing was controversial. Some scientists felt the team was going public prematurely, making bold claims before the evidence had been rigorously evaluated by peers. And when peer review did happen, the reviews were mixed. Some reviewers found the evidence compelling, or at least intriguing enough to warrant serious consideration, but others were deeply skeptical. They identified methodological issues, alternative interpretations, and gaps in the data that undermined the burial hypothesis. The debate that followed has been one of the most contentious in recent paleoanthropology. Scientists taking strong positions on both sides, press coverage ranging from credulous acceptance to harsh criticism, and in the middle of it all, the Rising Star team defending their interpretations while critics demanded more rigorous evidence. Let's look at the criticisms because they're important for understanding where the controversy stands. First, several independent researchers questioned the sediment analysis. XRF and PSD are powerful techniques, but they require careful methodology. You need to collect samples systematically, analyze them properly, and compare them to appropriate controls. Critics pointed out that the data presented in the initial papers was incomplete. The exact sampling locations weren't always clear, the statistical analysis was limited, and crucially, when independent researchers tried to replicate the findings using the published data, they couldn't. They didn't see the patterns of sediment mixing that the Rising Star team reported. A study led by Kimberly Foker, at George Mason University specifically addressed this. Her team reanalyzed the geochemical data and found no convincing evidence of sediment disturbance, no clear signatures of excavation and refilling. The chemical and particle size variations that the Rising Star team interpreted as evidence of burial looked to Foeke's team like normal variation you'd expect in cave sediments. Caves are dynamic environments. Water percolates through, minerals precipitate out, organisms burrow. All of these processes create variability in sediment chemistry and grain size without any need for hominin excavation. Second, critics argued that the features themselves aren't clearly defined. The edges of the supposed burial pits aren't sharp. They're gradual transitions. Natural depressions in cave floors are common, created by differential erosion, mineral dissolution, or settling of sediments. Just because bones are in a depression doesn't mean the depression was excavated. It might have been there already, and bones accumulated in a low spot through natural processes. The Rising Star team argues the depressions cut across sediment layers, which is evidence of excavation, but critics say the stratigraphy isn't clear enough to be certain. The photographs and diagrams presented in the papers, they argue, don't show unambiguous evidence of pits cut into pre-existing deposits. Third, there's the question of articulation. Yes, some skeletal elements are found in association, but how complete is the articulation? In a true burial, where a body is placed and covered, you expect tight articulation, all the bones in anatomical position. The Feature 1 skeleton is described as nearly complete, with articulated elements, but the published data shows it's partial. Many bones are missing. Some elements are displaced. Is this the preservation you'd expect from burial, or could it be a body that decomposed on the surface, with most bones scattered by various processes and only some elements remaining in loose association? Fourth, critics point out the absence of direct dating. The features themselves haven't been dated. The sediments inside the supposed burial pits haven't been dated independently from the bones. What we have are dates for Naledi fossils in the cave, showing they're 300 to 236,000 years old. But we don't know if the features are the same age as the fossils. Maybe the bones are ancient and the disturbances are more recent, caused by other processes or even by other species. Without direct dates on the features, we can't be certain they're associated with Naledi. Fifth, and this is a broader methodological critique, the papers didn't employ standard archaeothanatological methods. Archaeothanatology is the study of what happens to bodies after death, specifically in archaeological contexts. It's a whole subfield with established protocols for identifying burials. You examine bone position, decomposition patterns, evidence of wrapping or containment, taphonomic changes. The initial papers didn't include this kind of detailed analysis. They focused heavily on the sedimentology, on the features themselves, but less on the detailed taphonomy of the bones within those features. Subsequent revisions addressed some of these concerns, but critics argue the analysis still isn't complete enough to definitively prove burial. One of the peer reviewers, identified as Reviewer 1 in the public review process, was particularly critical. She wrote extensive comments pointing out that the evidence was incomplete and inadequate to support the burial hypothesis, that the taphonomy wasn't fully analyzed, that the team needed to do more work before making such extraordinary claims. When the team later claimed that all reviewers had come to support the burial hypothesis, Reviewer 1 publicly disputed this, stating on the record that she had not changed her position and that the revised papers still didn't meet the evidentiary standard required. So where does this leave us? The burial hypothesis is contested, heavily contested. Some researchers find the evidence suggestive, worth pursuing with further investigation. Others find it unconvincing, arguing that natural processes can explain everything the Rising Star team has found, and that the claims of deliberate burial are premature. And still others take intermediate positions, acknowledging that something unusual was happening with Naledi bodies in these caves, but uncertain whether burial is the right term for it. Here's one way to think about it. There's a spectrum of mortuary behavior. At one end, you have complete indifference to the dead. Body falls, everyone moves on, scavengers take care of the rest. At the other end, you have elaborate funerary rituals, prepared graves, positioned bodies, grave goods, ceremonies, belief systems about death and afterlife. This is what humans do, and what Neanderthals apparently did to some degree. Removing bodies from living areas because decomposition is unpleasant or attracts predators, caching bodies in remote locations to keep them away from the group, maybe digging shallow depressions to partially cover remains. These are mortuary behaviors, responses to death that involve doing something with bodies, but they're not full-fledged burial with all the cultural and symbolic meanings that implies. Maybe Homo naledi was somewhere in the middle of this spectrum. Maybe they were removing dead group members from living areas, taking them to remote cave chambers where the bodies wouldn't be a problem. Maybe they were doing something with the bodies once they got them there, arranging them, covering them partially with sediment, creating depressions to place them in. But maybe this behavior was driven by practical concerns, hygiene, or fear of predators attracted to carrion, rather than symbolic beliefs about death and the dead. That would still be remarkable. It would still show planning, cooperation, and intentionality, but it wouldn't necessarily require the kind of symbolic cognition that full-fledged burial implies. Or maybe the burial hypothesis is correct. Maybe Homo naledi, with its small brain and primitive features, really was engaging in culturally patterned funerary behavior 300,000 years ago, digging graves, positioning bodies, placing objects with the dead, performing some kind of ritual or protocol that had meaning within their social groups. If so, it rewrites our understanding of cognitive evolution. It means symbolic thought is much older than we thought. It means brain size is even less important than we realized. It means cultural complexity can emerge through multiple evolutionary pathways, not just through the expansion of brains. The evidence isn't definitive yet. Both sides acknowledge this, even as they argue about what the evidence actually shows. More excavation is needed, more analysis, more rigorous testing of alternative hypotheses. Ideally, independent teams should be brought in to assess the features, to conduct their own sediment analyses, to examine the bones with fresh eyes and no stake in proving a particular interpretation. Science works best when claims are tested by people trying to disprove them, not just by the team making the claims. But here's what we can say with confidence. Something unusual was happening at Rising Star. Naledi bodies were ending up in deep, dark, inaccessible chambers. Multiple individuals, across multiple chambers, over what appears to be an extended time period. This distribution pattern doesn't match natural accumulation. It doesn't match predator activity. It doesn't match death trap scenarios. Some kind of behavior was involved. Bodies were being transported, placed, and left in specific locations. Whether you call that burial, caching, disposal, or something else without a modern equivalent, it represents complex behavior, repeated behavior, patterned behavior. And that alone is significant. It means Homo naledi was more capable than its brain size would suggest, more intentional, more planful. Whether or not the burial hypothesis is ultimately supported, we've already learned that Naledi could navigate complex cave systems, could coordinate to transport bodies, could return repeatedly to the same locations for the same purpose. That's not simple behavior. That's not what we'd expect from a species with a brain barely larger than a chimpanzee's. And it forces us to reconsider what cognitive capabilities are necessary for what kinds of behaviors. Maybe we've been setting the bar too high. Maybe we've been assuming that human-like symbolic culture requires human-like brain size. Maybe we've been wrong. The burial debate will continue. Papers will be published arguing for and against. New evidence will be discovered and analyzed. Teams will refine their methods and sharpen their critiques. This is how science works. Slowly, messily, with heated disagreements and gradual convergence toward whatever the truth turns out to be. In the meantime, the bones remain. Deep in the darkness, bones that got there somehow. Bones that tell a story we're still learning to read, whether it's a story of burial or caching or some other behavior we don't have a name for yet. It's a story about a species we didn't know existed until a decade ago. A species that keeps surprising us. That keeps refusing to fit the categories we've built. And maybe that's the real lesson. Maybe human evolution is stranger, more diverse, more experimentally creative than we've imagined. Maybe there were many ways of being human, and maybe Homo naledi represents one of those ways, preserved in stone and darkness, waiting for us to figure out what it means. But the burial claims weren't the only explosive announcements to come from the Rising Star cave system. There were two other pieces of evidence that Lee Berger and his team presented alongside the burial hypothesis. Evidence that, if verified, would make the story of Homo naledi even more extraordinary and even more controversial. First, fire. If Naledi was navigating deep into these cave chambers through passages like the chute and Superman's crawl, in complete darkness 30 meters underground, they would have needed light. There's simply no other way to explain how they could make the journey safely and repeatedly. The human eye, the primate eye, cannot function in absolute darkness. We're visual creatures. Strip away light and we're effectively blind. Navigating a complex three-dimensional environment, climbing over obstacles, squeezing through gaps, descending vertical shafts, all of this is difficult enough with modern caving equipment and artificial lighting. Doing it in darkness would be suicide. So if Naledi was getting bodies into these chambers, they must have had some form of illumination. And in a pre-electric world, that means fire. Controlled use of fire is one of the major technological achievements in human evolution. Homo erectus was probably using fire at least 1 million years ago, maybe earlier. Evidence of hearths, burned bones, heat-altered stones, all of this appears in archaeological sites associated with erectus across Africa and Eurasia. By 300,000 years ago, fire use was widespread among large-brained human species. Neanderthals were definitely using fire. Early Homo sapiens were using fire. It's not surprising that a contemporary hominin species would also use fire. Using fire in a deep cave system for illumination during body transport is a very specific application. It suggests planning, preparation, and understanding that you'll need light for a journey into darkness. That's cognitively sophisticated. The Rising Star team reported finding evidence of fire use in the cave system. Not definitive evidence like clear hearths or large charcoal deposits, but traces, soot-like residues on cave walls in passages leading to the Naledi chambers, discoloration patterns that might indicate smoke exposure, chemical signatures consistent with burning organic materials, areas where rock surfaces appear to have been exposed to heat, and scattered fragments of material that could be charred wood or burned organic matter, though too degraded to identify conclusively. The team's argument is that these traces, while not individually definitive, collectively suggest fire use. Torches, probably. Bundles of grass or wood, maybe coated with resin or animal fat to make them burn longer and brighter. Naledi would have needed multiple torches for each journey into the depths. The passages are long. A single torch wouldn't last. They would have needed to prepare in advance, gather materials, construct the torches, light them, and carry them through the cave. And they would have needed to do this repeatedly for each body transport event. That's planning. That's foresight. That's technology. But here's the problem. The evidence for fire use hasn't been independently dated. We don't know if the traces on the cave walls are 300,000 years old, contemporary with the Naledi fossils, or if they're more recent, left by other species or even modern humans who entered the caves thousands of years ago. The cave system was used by modern cavers starting in the 1960s. Could some of the burn traces be from modern carbide lamps or torches? The team argues that the patterns and locations make this unlikely, but without direct dates, we can't be certain. More problematically, no definitive fire materials have been found in the chambers themselves. No charcoal in the sediments where Naledi bones were found. No burned bone, no hearths, no ash layers. If Naledi was using torches to navigate the cave, you'd expect to find evidence of those torches in the chambers where they were deposited or accidentally dropped. The absence of this evidence is puzzling. Either the torches were carefully removed after each visit, which seems unlikely, or fire use wasn't as extensive as the hypothesis suggests, or the traces of fire have degraded beyond recognition over 300,000 years. Critics have been blunt about the fire evidence. It's suggestive at best, they say, possibly consistent with fire use, but far from proof. The soot-like residues could be mineral deposits. The discoloration could be water staining or algae growth. The heat signatures could be from natural geological processes. Without rigorous chemical analysis, without direct dating, without finding actual charcoal or burned materials in clear association with Naledi fossils, the fire hypothesis remains speculative. Some researchers have published papers explicitly stating there is no convincing scientific evidence for fire use by Homo naledi. Not yet, anyway. The team is working on it. They've stated in multiple forums that more analysis is underway, that they're using advanced techniques to sample and date the wall residues, that they're conducting detailed surveys to map all potential fire traces throughout the cave system. But this work takes time, and until it's completed and published and peer-reviewed, the fire hypothesis remains in limbo. Intriguing? Now let's talk about the engravings, because this is where the claims become truly paradigm-shifting. If the burial hypothesis is extraordinary, and the fire hypothesis is controversial, the engraving claims are explosive. In 2022, during one of the excavation seasons, Lee Berger himself entered the Naledi chamber for the first time. He'd watched his team work via video feeds, coordinated the excavation from the surface, analyzed the bones as they came up, but never been able to experience the chamber firsthand. So he lost weight, got in shape, trained until he could squeeze through that 18-centimeter gap, and descended into the darkness. As he explored the hill antechamber, the space at the base of the chute where it opens into the larger Naledi chamber, he noticed something. Marks on the rock, not natural fractures or erosion patterns. Lines. Deliberate lines. Scratched into the surface of a limestone pillar that separates the two spaces. He looked closer. The lines formed patterns. Crosshatches. Geometric shapes. Some overlapping, some parallel. All clearly intentional. Someone had stood in this chamber, in the dark, and scratched designs into the rock. The team documented the engravings extensively. High-resolution photography, 3D scanning, microscopic analysis of the tool marks. The engravings are deeply impressed, meaning significant force was applied. The surfaces bearing the marks appear to have been prepared, smoothed before engraving. In some areas, there's a residue that creates a sheen on the rock surface, possibly from repeated handling or rubbing. And there's evidence that dirt or sand was applied to the surface, perhaps as an abrasive to help make the marks, or perhaps as part of some process we don't understand. The patterns themselves are abstract. Hashtag-like crosshatches, repeated line segments, geometric arrangements that don't obviously represent anything from the natural world. This is important because it suggests symbolic intent. If the marks depicted animals or plants or tools, we might interpret them as practical recording, visual documentation of what was seen or done. But abstract geometric patterns, those are purely symbolic. They have meaning, but that meaning is arbitrary, assigned by the culture that created them. These kinds of marks are considered among the earliest evidence of symbolic thought in human evolution. Previously, the oldest known geometric engravings were associated with Homo sapiens and possibly Neanderthals. The Blombos cave in South Africa has abstract engravings dated to around 70,000 years ago, made by early modern humans. There are claims of earlier marks, possibly made by Homo erectus hundreds of thousands of years ago, but these are controversial and not widely accepted. If the rising star engravings were made by Homo naledi, and if they date to 300,000 years ago or so, they would be among the oldest known examples of intentional mark-making, and they would be the first such marks definitely associated with a small-brained hominin. But, and this is a significant but, we don't know if Naledi made these engravings. The marks can't be directly dated. We can't determine their age without dating the rock surface itself, and limestone is notoriously difficult to date. The engravings could be 300,000 years old. They could be 30,000 years old. They could be 3,000 years old. Without dates, we're making assumptions. The Rising Star team argues that since only Naledi fossils have been found in these chambers, Naledi must have made the engravings. But early Homo sapiens was also in southern Africa around this time. Modern humans existed by 300,000 years ago. They overlapped temporally with Naledi. Critics say yes, absolutely. The patterns look similar to other geometric engravings found in southern African archaeological sites, engravings that are definitely associated with Homo sapiens. The techniques used look consistent with later human mark-making. Maybe all the symbolic and technological evidence from Rising Star is actually from later human visitation, and Naledi was just the species whose bodies happened to be there. The research team has pushed back against this. They argue that the engravings are located near the areas with the densest concentrations of Naledi bones, that they're in chambers where no other species has been found, that the effort required to reach these locations, to navigate the difficult passages, makes it unlikely that Homo sapiens would have gone to the trouble just to scratch marks on cave walls. If sapiens had been in these chambers, surely they would have left other evidence. Tools, remains, hearths, the kinds of materials that usually accompany human cave use. The absence of these materials suggests Naledi was the only species using these deep chambers. But absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence. Just because we haven't found sapiens' remains in the chambers doesn't mean sapiens was never there. Bodies could have decomposed completely. Tools could have been removed. Hearths could have been in locations that haven't been excavated yet. Or maybe Homo sapiens did briefly enter the cave, made some marks, and left without leaving other traces. It's possible. Without dates on the engravings themselves, we can't rule it out. There's another issue. The meaning of the engravings, if they were made by Naledi, is completely unknown. We can describe what we see, crosshatches and geometric patterns, but we have no idea what they signified. Attempts to sanctify or memorialize the space? Were they casual doodles made while waiting during body transport? Were they teaching tools, showing young Naledi how to make controlled marks? We're projecting our own cultural assumptions onto marks made by a different species hundreds of thousands of years ago. The meaning could be completely alien to anything we'd recognize. Some researchers have suggested the marks might not be symbolic at all. Maybe they're practical, scratching the rock to test its properties, preparing surfaces for some purpose we don't understand. Even sharpening tools, though no stone tools have been found. The problem with functional explanations is that the patterns are repeated and geometric, which doesn't look like random testing or tool maintenance. But we can't know for certain. Without understanding Naledi cognition and culture, we're speculating. The broader scientific community has been deeply skeptical of the engraving claims. A paper published in the Journal of Human Evolution by several prominent paleoanthropologists explicitly stated there is no scientific evidence that Homo naledi produced rock art. The engravings are intriguing, they acknowledge, but attribution to Naledi is premature. Alternative explanations haven't been ruled out. The work needs more rigor before such bold claims can be accepted. This paper sparked considerable discussion. Lee Berger and his team responded, defending their interpretations and arguing that critics were being overly conservative. The back and forth has been public, sometimes heated, reflecting deep disagreements about evidence, standards, and scientific communication. Which brings us to a broader issue, the way these findings were announced. The Netflix documentary Cave of Bones was released in conjunction with the preprint papers, before peer review was complete. Before the scientific community had a chance to evaluate the claims carefully, the documentary presented the burial hypothesis, the fire evidence, and the engravings as established facts, as revolutionary discoveries that rewrite human evolution. It featured dramatic recreations of Naledi carrying bodies into caves, using fire, making engravings. Science communication is tricky. There's value in making discoveries accessible to the public, in generating excitement about research, in showing people why this work matters. But there's also risk. When you present hypotheses as facts before the evidence is fully vetted, you can mislead people. When you make extraordinary claims in documentary form, rather than through the usual slow process of peer review and scientific debate, you're bypassing the quality control mechanisms that help science self-correct. And when your claims are challenged by other researchers, the public might not hear those challenges or might dismiss them as professional jealousy or stick-in-the-mud conservatism. Several researchers who served as peer reviewers for the Rising Star papers have gone on record expressing frustration with how their reviews were characterized. They pointed out problems with the evidence. They suggested additional analyses. They recommended caution in making strong claims. But then the papers were published, and press releases went out, and the Netflix documentary aired, and suddenly the burial hypothesis was being presented as fact. The reviewers felt their concerns had been downplayed or ignored. Some of them published separate papers laying out their criticisms in detail. Others gave interviews questioning the evidence. The scientific process, usually happening behind closed doors in peer review, spilled into public view. This has created an uncomfortable situation. The general public has been told that Homo naledi buried its dead, used fire, and made engravings. These claims have been widely reported in mainstream media. They're now part of popular understanding of human evolution. But within the scientific community, these claims are contested, debated, far from settled. The disconnect between public perception and scientific consensus is significant, and it raises questions about how we communicate uncertain science. How do we balance the desire to share exciting discoveries with the need to accurately convey the level of certainty and the existence of alternative interpretations? Lee Berger has been unapologetic about his approach. He argues that the traditional slow pace of scientific publication means important discoveries can take years to reach the public, that by the time findings make it through peer review and journal publication, the moment for public engagement has passed. That using documentaries and media engagement allows broader audiences to participate in scientific discovery in real time. That opening up the process, making data freely available, inviting scrutiny and debate, ultimately benefits science, even if it's messy and contentious. His critics counter that this approach erodes trust in science, that when bold claims are later challenged or revised, the public sees only confusion and disagreement, that scientific credibility depends on careful vetting of evidence before announcements, that peer review exists for good reasons, to catch errors and biases, to ensure claims are supported by adequate evidence, that bypassing or minimizing this process, even in the name of public engagement, does more harm than good. Both sides have points. Science does need to be more accessible, more transparent, more engaged with public audiences. But science also needs to maintain standards, to distinguish between hypotheses and conclusions, to honestly communicate uncertainty. The rising star controversy highlights tensions that exist across many fields. How do we do science in the age of social media and streaming documentaries? How do we balance speed with rigor? How do we share discoveries without overhyping them? Meanwhile, the evidence continues to be analyzed. New papers are in preparation. More excavations are planned. The debate over burial, fire, and engravings will continue for years, perhaps decades. Eventually, we'll reach something like consensus. Either the burial hypothesis will be supported by additional evidence that satisfies critics, or it will be abandoned in favor of alternative explanations. Either the fire traces will be dated and confirmed, or they'll be shown to be from other sources. Either the engravings will be attributed to Naledi with confidence, or they'll remain ambiguous. What we're witnessing is science in action. It's not neat. It's not simple. It involves researchers passionately defending their interpretations, while others equally passionately critique them. It involves uncertainty, revision, gradual convergence toward truth through a process that's often frustrating and sometimes contentious. This is normal. This is how science works. The rising star discoveries are important enough and controversial enough that the process is playing out in public view, and that's uncomfortable for everyone involved. But it's also, potentially, educational. Because the public is seeing that science isn't a collection of facts handed down by authorities. It's a process. A messy, human, ongoing process of trying to understand the world through evidence and argument and constant questioning. And in the middle of all this controversy, all these debates and critiques and defenses, there are still the bones. In chambers that are difficult to reach and darker than night. Bones of a species we didn't know existed until 2013. Bones that got there somehow. Bones that tell a story we're still trying to understand. Whether it's a story of burial and fire and symbol making, or a story of something simpler but still remarkable, it's a story about our family tree. About the many experiments that nature tried before arriving at us. And that story, whatever its details turn out to be, is worth the argument, worth the uncertainty, worth the long, slow process of figuring out what actually happened 300,000 years ago in the darkness beneath South Africa. Let's talk about what happened after the announcements. Because the controversy over Homo Naledi burial claims became one of the most heated scientific debates in recent paleoanthropology. Papers published specifically to refute the burial hypothesis. Public statements from prominent scientists questioning not just the evidence, but the way the research was conducted and communicated. This wasn't just normal scientific disagreement. This was a firestorm. Part of the intensity came from what was at stake. If the burial hypothesis is correct, it fundamentally changes our understanding of human cognitive evolution. It means symbolic thought, cultural behavior, ritualized treatment of the dead, all of these supposedly unique human traits might be much older and more widespread than we believed. It means brain size is even less important than we thought. It means we need to completely revise our models of how complex behavior emerges. These are big implications, paradigm-shifting implications, and extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. Many scientists felt the evidence presented didn't meet that standard. The first major published critique came from a group of prominent researchers, including Maria Martinon Torres, a paleoanthropologist who has studied some of the oldest human burials in Africa. Her team published a paper in the Journal of Human Evolution with a blunt title expressing their position. They examined the 3 preprint papers that the Rising Star team had posted about burials and engravings, and they concluded that the evidence was not compelling enough to support the claims. Not even close. Their critique was systematic and detailed. On the burial hypothesis, they pointed out that the features identified as graves don't have clear boundaries. Natural depressions in cave floors are common, they noted. Without sharp edges cutting across undisturbed sediment layers, you can't definitively say a pit was excavated. They argued that the stratigraphic evidence presented was ambiguous, that the photographs and diagrams in the papers didn't clearly show pits dug into pre-existing deposits, that alternative explanations involving natural sediment accumulation could account for what was observed. On the sediment mixing evidence, they were even more critical. XRF and PSD analyses can show chemical and particle size variation, but these variations can be produced by many natural processes. Water percolation through cave sediments, bioturbation from burrowing organisms, differential mineral deposition, post-depositional disturbance from root growth or rock movement. Without demonstrating that the specific patterns observed could only come from deliberate excavation and refilling, the evidence was weak. They pointed out that the Rising Star team hadn't adequately ruled out these natural alternatives. They also noted the absence of key information in the papers. Where exactly were sediment samples collected? What were the specific XRF and PSD values for different locations? What statistical tests were used to determine if differences were significant? The data presentation was incomplete, they argued, making it impossible for other researchers to properly evaluate the findings or attempt replication. This is a fundamental principle of science. Your methods and data need to be transparent and complete enough that others can assess and reproduce your work. If they can't, your conclusions remain uncertain. On the articulation of skeletal remains, Martinon Torres and colleagues were skeptical. Yes, some bones were found in association, but the degree of articulation wasn't clearly documented. In a true burial where a body is placed and covered quickly, you expect tight articulation with all bones in anatomical position. The published photos showed partial skeletons with many missing elements. Were these burial-quality articulations? Or were they the kind of loose associations you might get from bodies decomposing on the surface with only some bones remaining together? Without detailed taphonomic analysis, showing that articulation patterns matched burial scenarios rather than surface decomposition, the evidence was ambiguous. On the grave good, the stone tool supposedly buried with one individual, they questioned whether it was truly associated. One stone in a cave doesn't necessarily mean it was intentionally placed with a body. Stones end up in caves through many natural processes. They fall from the ceiling. They wash in with water. They're carried in by animals. Without clear evidence that this particular stone was deliberately worked, definitely not part of the natural cave geology, and positioned intentionally with skeletal remains, it couldn't be taken as proof of burial with grave goods. On the engravings, they were even more dismissive. The marks can't be dated. The attribution to Homo naledi is purely circumstantial, based on the presence of Naledi fossils in the cave, but not on any direct evidence linking Naledi to the mark-making. The patterns look similar to later engravings made by Homo sapiens. Without ruling out the possibility that modern humans entered the cave and made the marks, perhaps tens of thousands of years after Naledi was gone, the claim that Naledi made them is unsupported speculation, and on fire use, they found no convincing evidence at all. Soot-like residues that haven't been chemically characterized or dated, discoloration that could be mineral staining, absence of charcoal or burned materials in the sediments. This doesn't meet the standard for demonstrating controlled fire use. Many caves have discolored walls and unclear residues. You need clear evidence, charcoal deposits, burned bones, fire-altered stones, before claiming fire use. Their conclusion was stark. The papers presented suggestive observations that warranted further investigation, but they did not provide sufficient scientific evidence for the extraordinary claims being made. The burial hypothesis, the fire use, the engraving attribution, all of these remained speculative. More work was needed, more rigorous analysis, more careful consideration of alternative explanations. Until that work was done, the claims should be treated as preliminary hypotheses rather than established findings. This paper got attention. It was published in a major journal. It was written by respected researchers with deep expertise in human evolution and early archaeology, and it directly challenged the narrative that had been presented in the Netflix documentary and popular press. Suddenly, the public was seeing that the story wasn't as settled as they'd been led to believe, that there was serious scientific dispute about these findings, that experts had major concerns about the evidence and methodology. Then came the replication attempts. Kimberly Fouquet, at George Mason University, led a team that tried to reproduce the sediment analysis findings. They took the XRF and PSD data that the Rising Star team had published and applied standard analytical protocols. They ran statistical tests. They compared results from inside the supposed burial features to results from outside, and they found nothing. No significant differences in chemical composition or particle size distribution that would indicate deliberate disturbance of sediments. The patterns that the Rising Star team had interpreted as evidence of excavation and refilling looked to Fouquet's team like normal background variation. This was damaging, because if the sediment evidence can't be reproduced by independent researchers using the published data, it raises serious questions. Either the original analysis had methodological problems, or the data was being overinterpreted, or there were aspects of the analysis that weren't fully described in the papers. Whatever the reason, the inability to replicate one of the key lines of evidence for burial was a significant blow to the hypothesis. Fouquet's team published their findings in Paleoanthropology, another well-regarded journal. Their paper was carefully worded but pointed. They noted that geochemical analysis in archaeology requires rigorous methodology and transparent reporting. They explained in detail what they tried to do and why it didn't work. They concluded that based on the published data, there was no sedimentological evidence for deliberate burial. They stopped short of saying the burial hypothesis was definitely wrong, but they made clear that the evidence presented didn't support it. The Rising Star team responded, "Of course." They argued that critics were applying inappropriate standards, that cave sediments are complex and require specialized analysis methods, that the full dataset and detailed methodology would be published in subsequent papers, that the criticisms were premature because they were based on incomplete information from the initial preprint versions. They maintained that when all the evidence was considered together, the burial interpretation was the most parsimonious explanation for what they observed. But the damage was done. The scientific community had seen that major aspects of the burial hypothesis couldn't be independently verified, that respected researchers had serious methodological concerns, that the evidence was contested rather than accepted. This doesn't mean the hypothesis is wrong. Science often involves initial proposals that are refined, revised, or rejected as more evidence accumulates and methods improve. But it does mean the claims were made prematurely, before the evidence was solid enough to convince independent experts, before the standard of proof required for such extraordinary findings had been met. One of the most significant moments in the controversy came when one of the peer reviewers went public. Jamie Hodgkins, an archaeologist at the University of Colorado, Denver, had been reviewer one for the burial hypothesis papers. She'd provided extensive comments during peer review, pointing out problems with the evidence and methodology. And when the Rising Star team publicly claimed that all reviewers had come to support the burial hypothesis in the revised versions, Hodgkins spoke out. "I didn't support the hypothesis in the initial review, and I don't support it in the revised version." This was unusual. Peer review is normally confidential. Reviewers remain anonymous. Their comments are shared with authors but not made public. But in this case, with the Rising Star team making public claims about reviewer support, Hodgkins felt compelled to set the record straight. She published a statement explaining her concerns. She detailed what she'd asked for in her reviews and what hadn't been adequately addressed in the revisions. And she made clear that characterizing the reviewers as unanimous in support was misleading and potentially harmful to scientific discourse. This created an awkward situation. Here was a peer reviewer publicly contradicting the author's characterization of the review process. What happens when authors go public with claims about their papers before peer review is complete? What happens when they characterize reviewer feedback in ways that reviewers feel are inaccurate? These are thorny questions about scientific communication and process that the Rising Star controversy brought into sharp focus. Other researchers weighed in through various channels. Some published formal comments on the papers. Others gave interviews to science journalists. Still, others posted detailed critiques on social media and academic forums. A pattern emerged. Most researchers agreed that something interesting was happening at Rising Star, that the concentration of Naledi fossils in inaccessible cave chambers required some behavioral explanation. But many were deeply skeptical that burial, in the cultural sense, was the right explanation. They favored simpler interpretations. Body disposal, caching of dead in remote locations, perhaps ritualized but not necessarily symbolic. And most agreed that the fire and engraving claims were even more speculative. Part of the controversy stemmed from definitional issues. What exactly counts as burial? Or does burial require excavating a pit specifically for the purpose? If bodies are arranged in specific postures, is that evidence of ritual? Or could it happen through natural settling as flesh decomposes? If sediments covering bodies have different composition from surrounding sediments, is that proof of deliberate filling, or could it result from natural processes operating differently in depressed areas versus elevated areas? These aren't trivial questions. They go to the heart of what evidence is required to demonstrate intentional burial. And they highlight a broader issue in archaeology. We're trying to infer behavior from material remains. We're looking at patterns in bones and stones and sediments and making guesses about what caused those patterns. Sometimes the inferences are strong, backed by multiple independent lines of evidence. Sometimes they're weak, based on ambiguous patterns that could have multiple causes. The Rising Star findings fall somewhere in the middle. Suggestive but not definitive, interesting but not conclusive. The controversy also reflects different philosophies about scientific communication. Lee Berger has long advocated for open science, making data freely available, sharing findings rapidly through preprints, engaging public audiences through documentaries and media. He argues this approach democratizes science, allows more people to participate in discovery, and speeds the pace of research by enabling rapid feedback and collaboration. His critics argue that going public before peer review is complete can mislead the public and damage scientific credibility. That extraordinary claims need extraordinary vetting before being announced, that the traditional publication process exists for good reasons and shouldn't be bypassed. Both approaches have merit. Open science has benefits: transparency, accessibility, faster dissemination of findings. But traditional peer review also has benefits: quality control, careful vetting, time for considered evaluation before claims enter public discourse. The Rising Star controversy highlights tensions between these models, and it raises questions about what science communication should look like in the 21st century. How do we balance openness with rigor? How do we share exciting discoveries without overhyping them? How do we maintain public trust while acknowledging uncertainty? If you've been following this story, listening to this long narrative about tiny brains and dark caves and bones that got somewhere they shouldn't be, you might be wondering, Are the burial claims real? Did Homo naledi really engage in cultural treatment of the dead? Or is this a case of researchers seeing patterns that aren't really there, interpreting ambiguous evidence in ways that support exciting but unsupported conclusions? The honest answer is we don't know yet. The evidence is contested. Smart, careful researchers disagree. Some think the burial hypothesis is plausible and worth taking seriously. Others think it's unsupported speculation. The scientific process hasn't reached consensus. More evidence is needed, more analysis, more time for researchers to examine the findings, conduct independent tests, and form considered judgments. This is uncomfortable if you want a clear answer. But it's reality. Science doesn't always provide immediate certainty. Sometimes you have to live with ambiguity while the evidence accumulates and interpretations are refined. What we can say is this: Homo naledi was doing something unusual with its dead. Bodies ended up in remote, inaccessible cave chambers. This happened repeatedly, across multiple chambers. Natural processes don't adequately explain the distribution and condition of the fossils, so behavior was involved. The Rising Star team interprets it as burial, as culturally patterned mortuary practice with symbolic significance. Critics think it might be simpler: body disposal, caching, removal of corpses from living areas. Maybe there were shallow depressions used for placement. Maybe bodies were arranged in certain ways. But this doesn't necessarily mean burial in the full cultural sense. It could be pragmatic behavior, driven by hygiene concerns or predator avoidance, rather than symbolic beliefs about death and the dead. The controversy will continue. Papers will continue being published, some supporting the burial hypothesis, others criticizing it. The Rising Star team will undoubtedly produce more evidence as they continue excavating and analyzing. Critics will evaluate that evidence and push for more rigorous standards. Gradually, over years, the scientific community will converge towards some consensus about what actually happened at Rising Star. The debate remains heated, and Homo naledi remains one of the most controversial and fascinating hominin species ever discovered. What we're witnessing is science doing what science does, self-correcting through argument and evidence. Multiple researchers examining the same findings and reaching different conclusions. Debates playing out in journals and conferences, and now increasingly in public forums. It's messy. It's uncertain. It sometimes involves personal conflicts and professional rivalries. But it's also how we make progress, how we distinguish between what we know, what we think we know, and what we're still figuring out. But it's also, potentially, advancing our understanding. Because whether the burial hypothesis is ultimately supported or rejected, we're learning more about Homo naledi, more about the possibilities and limits of small-brained cognition, more about the diversity of human evolution, and more about how to study and interpret evidence from deep time. And maybe that's enough for now, to know that the questions are important, that the evidence is being carefully examined, that smart people are working hard to figure out what happened 300,000 years ago in the darkness beneath South Africa. The answers will come, maybe not as quickly as we'd like, maybe not as definitively as we'd prefer, but they'll come, because that's what science does. Slowly, carefully, with many detours and wrong turns and heated arguments along the way, it moves toward truth. And Homo naledi, with all its mysteries and controversies, is pushing us to think harder about what it means to be human, about where we came from, and what makes us unique, about the many evolutionary experiments that led to us. That's worth the uncertainty, worth the debate. Let's step back from the burial controversy for a moment. Set aside the debates about pits and sediments and symbolic thought, because regardless of how those arguments resolve, there's still the remarkable anatomy of Homo naledi itself, and some of the most fascinating details come from the extremities, the hands and feet. These structures tell their own story about how Naledi lived, how it moved through its world, what it was capable of doing. And that story is just as strange and compelling as anything involving caves and darkness. Start with the feet. If you lined up a Homo naledi foot next to a modern human foot, without labels, you'd have trouble telling them apart. The overall proportions are human, The arch is present, that crucial curved structure running along the inside of the foot from heel to ball. The big toe, the hallux, is aligned with the other toes rather than diverging at an angle like an ape's grasping toe. The ankle joint is robust, with articular surfaces clearly designed for the stresses of habitual bipedal walking. Every bone in the Naledi foot says the same thing. This species walked on two legs. Not occasionally, not as a secondary mode of locomotion. Habitually. Committed bipedalism. The arch is particularly significant. In apes, feet are relatively flat with flexible midfoot joints that allow the foot to grasp branches. The big toe diverges from the other toes, creating an opposable structure perfect for gripping cylindrical tree limbs. When apes walk bipedally, which they can do for short distances, they walk flat-footed and awkwardly. The foot anatomy isn't optimized for bipedalism, but humans have a different foot structure. The midfoot bones are arranged in an arch that acts as a spring, storing and releasing energy with each step. This makes walking efficient, reduces the metabolic cost of covering distance. Combined with aligned toes and a non-divergent big toe, the human foot is a bipedal walking machine. Homo naledi had this foot. The arch is clearly visible in the fossil specimens. The toes are aligned. The big toe is oriented forward. The ankle and heel bones have the right shapes for absorbing impact and transmitting forces during upright walking. Some researchers have done detailed biomechanical analyses of the Naledi foot, using computer modeling to estimate how it functioned during walking. The results show that Naledi would have walked very much like modern humans, not shuffling or waddling, not moving with bent knees and awkward gait, walking with straight legs, heel-strike footfalls, efficient stride mechanics. This was a species built for covering ground on 2 feet. This raises interesting questions. Long-distance bipedal walking requires more than just appropriate foot anatomy. It requires specific leg proportions, hip structures, spinal curvature, all working together as an integrated system. And Naledi had these features too. Long tibiae, the shin bones, which increase stride length. Femora, thigh bones, with the right angle and muscle attachment points for efficient walking. A pelvis that, while more flared than in modern humans, still permits effective bipedal locomotion. The whole lower body package says Naledi was a walker, capable of covering long distances efficiently, not as perfectly designed for endurance walking as modern humans, but in the same adaptive zone. Why would a species need to be such an efficient walker? In modern humans, bipedal endurance is linked to subsistence strategies. We're pursuit predators and long-distance foragers. We walk or jog for hours, tracking game, searching for water, moving between seasonal resource patches. Our ability to cover distance is a major part of what makes us ecologically successful. If Naledi had similar foot and leg anatomy, it might have had similar ranging patterns. Moving across landscapes in search of resources, following migratory animals, traveling between distant food sources. This doesn't necessarily mean Naledi was doing persistence hunting like modern humans, but it does suggest an active ranging lifestyle requiring efficient terrestrial locomotion. Now look at the hands, and here's where things get really interesting because Naledi hands tell a different story, or rather, they tell 2 stories simultaneously. The wrist bones, the carpals, are arranged almost exactly like modern human wrist bones. The wrist joint has the mobility and stability characteristics that human wrists have, allowing a wide range of hand positions and force transmission. The thumb is long and muscular with a broad tip, just like human thumbs. The muscle attachment sites on the thumb bones indicate powerful opposition, the ability to press the thumb against the fingertips with force. This is precision grip anatomy, the stuff of tool use and manipulation. The palm bones, the metacarpals, have the right curvature. Human hands can cup objects, can conform to irregular shapes, can manipulate things with fine motor control. Apes have more limited hand mobility. Their palms are flatter, their fingers longer and more curved, optimized for grasping branches rather than manipulating objects. Naledi palms are human-like. The fingers can spread wide or press together. The hand can form a power grip for holding large objects or a precision grip for controlling small ones. Every anatomical feature of the Naledi wrist and palm suggests sophisticated manipulative capability. If you found these wrist and palm bones without any other context, you'd conclude they came from a tool-using species, something that regularly engaged in complex manipulation, making stone tools, processing food with tools, using the hands for precise, controlled movements. The anatomy is that clear, that human-like. Several researchers who've studied the Naledi hand have said explicitly that these are hands capable of making and using Oldowan or even Acheulean stone tools. The tool industries associated with early Homo species from 1 to 2 million years ago. The capability is there in the bones. But then you look at the fingers, the phalanges, the finger bones, and they're curved. Every finger bone from multiple individuals shows this pronounced curvature. This is the opposite of human finger bones, which are relatively straight. Curved fingers are an adaptation for climbing, for suspensory behavior, for gripping tree branches and supporting body weight with the hands. Modern apes have curved fingers. Australopithecines had curved fingers. But humans don't. Our fingers straightened as we lost the need for arboreal locomotion. We're committed ground dwellers, and our hand anatomy reflects that. Naledi has ape-like curved fingers. The curvature is comparable to what you see in chimpanzees or orangutans. But Naledi also has human-like wrists and palms. How do you reconcile this? How does one species have hands simultaneously optimized for tool manipulation and for tree climbing? Using its hands for manipulation and tool use on the ground, and for climbing and suspensory movement in trees. Living a dual lifestyle, terrestrial but with significant arboreal components. Here's what makes this even more puzzling. The finger curvature is more pronounced in adults than in juveniles. In most species, if you have a vestigial trait, something left over from an earlier evolutionary stage that's no longer functionally important, that trait tends to be more prominent in juveniles and reduces with development. But Naledi shows the opposite pattern. Young individuals have less curved fingers. Old individuals have more curved fingers. This suggests that climbing behavior was actually increasing with age, that adults were spending more time in trees than juveniles, that the curved fingers weren't vestigial remnants, but actively maintained adaptations for ongoing behavior. What was Naledi doing in trees? This is hard to answer, because we don't know what ecological niche Naledi occupied. We have no contextual evidence about Naledi diet, behavior, habitat preferences. All the fossils come from caves. We don't know what Naledi was doing outside those caves, but we can make inferences from anatomy. The combination of human-like feet for walking and curved fingers for climbing suggests a species that covered significant ground, but also regularly used arboreal resources. Maybe feeding on fruits, nuts, insects in trees, maybe climbing to escape predators, maybe sleeping in trees at night for safety. Chimpanzees do this, building nests in trees each evening. Maybe Naledi had similar behaviors. Or maybe the climbing capability served different functions at different life stages. Juveniles, staying mostly on the ground under adult supervision, becoming more arboreal as they matured and needed to exploit resources independently. Adults ranging widely on the ground during the day, but returning to trees for specific activities. The possibilities are numerous. What's clear is that Naledi wasn't a specialized ground dweller like modern humans. It retained significant climbing ability into adulthood, suggesting trees remained important in its lifestyle. The mosaic of features extends to other parts of the anatomy. The shoulders, for example. The scapula, the shoulder blade, in Naledi, is oriented more upward-facing than in modern humans. This is an adaptation for overhead arm use, for reaching up and pulling down, for the kinds of movements involved in climbing. Modern humans have more laterally oriented shoulder blades, optimized for forward arm movements like throwing. Naledi shoulders look more primitive, more like early Homo or Australopithecines. Again, the anatomy suggests regular climbing behavior. But at the same time, the trunk and lower body are optimized for bipedalism. The spine has the right curvature for upright posture. The pelvis allows for efficient walking, even if it's not as perfectly adapted as the human pelvis. The legs are proportioned for terrestrial ranging. It's like Naledi was hedging its evolutionary bets. Committing to bipedalism for terrestrial locomotion but maintaining climbing capabilities for arboreal resources and refugia. Not specializing completely in either direction, but keeping options open. This kind of mosaic anatomy is unusual in the genus Homo. Most species in our lineage show progressive commitment to terrestrial life. Homo erectus had fairly modern body proportions with limited climbing ability. Neanderthals were completely terrestrial. Homo sapiens is fully committed to ground dwelling. We're terrible climbers compared to apes. Our long legs, flat torsos, straight fingers, we're built for walking and running, not for navigating trees. Naledi represents a different trajectory, maintaining capabilities that other Homo species were losing. Why? Maybe environmental context explains it. If Naledi was living in mosaic habitats, areas with both open grasslands and patches of forest or woodland, maintaining both terrestrial and arboreal capabilities would be advantageous. You could exploit resources in both environments. You could escape predators by climbing when necessary. You could range widely on foot during the day and retreat to trees at night. This generalist strategy might have been successful in southern Africa during the Middle Pleistocene, when environmental conditions were variable and uncertain. Or maybe body size explains it. Naledi was small, around 88 pounds, which is small enough that climbing remains feasible even for adults. Larger-bodied species like Homo erectus or Homo heidelbergensis simply became too heavy to climb efficiently. Their weight would have made arboreal locomotion energetically expensive and risky. But Naledi could remain small and still walk efficiently on the ground, thanks to its modern foot and leg anatomy. Small body size plus modern lower limbs plus retained climbing capability equals a unique adaptive package. There's one more detail about the hands that's worth noting. The fingers are not just curved, they're proportionally long, longer than in most other Homo species, longer even than in many Australopithecines. The only comparisons are with Ardipithecus, a very early hominin from over 4 million years ago, and with one unusually long-fingered Homo sapiens individual from Kafse Cave in Israel. Long fingers increase grip strength and reach, useful for grasping branches and manipulating objects. But they also make the hand look unusual, almost exaggerated. Naledi hands would have looked different from ours, not just smaller, but differently proportioned, with those long curved fingers extending from human-like palms. What could Naledi do with these hands? The tool-using capability is clear from the wrist and thumb anatomy. The precision grip is there. The force transmission is there. The mobility is there. If Naledi wanted to make stone tools, it had the anatomical prerequisites. But no stone tools have been found in association with Naledi fossils. This absence is frustrating. We have the hands that could make tools, but we don't have the tools themselves. Why not? 3 possibilities. First, Naledi did make tools but used materials that don't preserve. Wood, bone, plant fibers, these all decompose in the African environment. Most tools from most of human prehistory have vanished without trace because they were made from organic materials. Only stone tools survive, and stone tools are a specialized subset of technology. Maybe Naledi was using wood digging sticks, bone probes, fiber containers, none of which we'll ever find. The tools are out there in the landscape waiting to be discovered at open-air sites that we haven't identified yet. Third, Naledi didn't make stone tools despite having hands capable of it. The potential was there anatomically, but the behavior never developed or was lost in this lineage. The third option seems least likely given the hand anatomy. The Naledi hand looks like a tool-using hand. Or maybe, and this is speculative, Naledi tool use was relatively simple and rare. Occasional utilization of unmodified objects, sticks for digging or probing, stones for smashing nuts or breaking bones. This kind of tool use wouldn't leave recognizable archaeological traces. The objects would be indistinguishable from natural materials. Only systematic stone tool manufacture creates the distinctive archaeological signature that we can identify millions of years later. So, the hands tell us Naledi had capability, potential for manipulation and tool use, but whether that potential was realized, and to what degree, remains unknown. The feet tell us Naledi walked, covered distance efficiently, moved through landscapes on 2 legs with modern mechanics, but the curved fingers tell us Naledi also climbed, regularly, into adulthood, that trees remained important in ways we don't fully understand. The extremities give us a picture of a species that was neither fully terrestrial nor fully arboreal. That was using both environments, moving between them, exploiting resources in each. A generalist in habitats and behaviors, not specialized for any single niche, but flexible enough to utilize multiple options. This flexibility might be key to understanding Naledi's success. How did a small-brained species survive in southern Africa contemporary with larger-brained hominins? Maybe by not competing directly, maybe by occupying ecological spaces that other species weren't using as effectively, maybe by maintaining capabilities that specialists had given up. The ability to climb meant access to arboreal resources that terrestrial species couldn't reach. The ability to walk efficiently meant range sizes comparable to other Homo species. The combination meant Naledi could exploit a broader resource base, could survive in variable environments, could adapt to changing conditions without needing to evolve new anatomy. And if Naledi was flexible in habitat use and resource exploitation, maybe it was flexible in behavior too. Maybe those tool-capable hands were used opportunistically, sometimes manipulating objects, sometimes climbing, adaptively depending on circumstances. Maybe the small brain was sufficient for this kind of flexibility because the behavior didn't require elaborate planning or complex social coordination. Just responsive adaptation to immediate environmental conditions. See food in a tree, climb and get it. Find useful object, pick it up and use it. Need to cross open terrain, walk efficiently. Simple behavioral rules implemented with adequate but not exceptional cognitive hardware. This is speculation, of course. Without behavioral observations, without ecological context, without tool assemblages, we're inferring lifestyle from bones. But bones are informative. They tell us what an organism could do, what biomechanical capabilities it had, what movements it was regularly performing. The hands and feet of Homo naledi tell us about a species comfortable in multiple environments, walking long distances on the ground, climbing into trees when needed, capable of precise manipulation, small but efficient, flexible but committed to bipedalism as primary locomotion. It's a unique combination, not quite like any other species in the human family tree. And it worked. It worked for hundreds of thousands of years in a challenging environment where multiple human species were competing and where many lineages went extinct. Naledi survived, and these extremities, these hands and feet that look like contradictory evolutionary experiments, they're part of how it did it. So here we are. We've spent hours exploring the mystery of Homo naledi, descending into dark caves, examining tiny brains and contradictory anatomy, debating burial pits and fire traces and scratches on cave walls. And maybe you're wondering, what does all this actually mean? Why does it matter whether one small-brained species from 300,000 years ago buried its dead or didn't? Why should we care about the details of fingers and feet and sediment chemistry? What are the bigger questions here? Let's start with the most fundamental one. What does it mean to be human? This sounds like a philosophy question, but it's actually central to paleoanthropology. For over a century, scientists have been trying to define what makes us unique, what separates humans from other animals, what makes us special, and the traditional answers have focused on a few key traits: big brains, complex language, sophisticated tool use, symbolic thought, culture, art, burial of the dead. The list varies depending on who you ask, but these are the usual suspects. The cognitive and behavioral features that supposedly make humans human. The problem is that every time we find a new fossil species, that list gets shorter. We keep discovering that traits we thought were uniquely human actually appeared earlier in evolution, or in different lineages, or in species with smaller brains than we expected. Neanderthals made art. We didn't know this until recently. They created abstract geometric patterns, wore ornamental shells and feathers, possibly even made rock engravings. For decades, we thought art was unique to Homo sapiens, evidence of our special cognitive abilities. Then we found Neanderthal art, and suddenly the story got more complicated. Art wasn't unique to us. It emerged independently in at least 2 human lineages. Maybe more. Tool use? Chimpanzees make tools. They fashion sticks to fish for termites, use stones to crack nuts, even make spears for hunting small primates. It's not sophisticated tool manufacture, but it's definitely intentional modification of objects for specific purposes. And chimps aren't alone. Dolphins use sponges to protect their rostrums while foraging. Tool use, it turns out, is fairly widespread in the animal kingdom. What makes human tool use special is the complexity and diversity. The cumulative culture where techniques build on previous innovations, the teaching and transmission across generations. But basic tool use? Not uniquely human. Language? This one's harder to assess in extinct species because language doesn't fossilize. We can look at brain structure, at the size and shape of regions involved in language processing. We can examine skeletal evidence for the descended larynx that allows the range of vocalizations humans produce. We can study patterns in tool manufacture and site organization that might indicate cultural transmission requiring language. But we can't know for certain what level of linguistic capability extinct species had. Neanderthals probably had language of some kind. Homo heidelbergensis might have. Earlier species? Unknown. The jury is still out on whether language is uniquely human or whether it emerged multiple times in different human lineages with varying degrees of complexity. This brings us to Homo naledi. If the burial hypothesis is correct, if Naledi was really engaging in mortuary practices, then we have to add another species to the list of hominins with symbolic behavior, and this one has a brain 1/3 the size of ours. This isn't Homo heidelbergensis or Homo erectus with their respectable if smaller brains. This is a species with a brain barely larger than a chimp's, and if it was burying the dead, creating meaning around death, engaging in ritualized treatment of bodies, then brain size clearly isn't the determining factor for symbolic thought. Even if the burial hypothesis is wrong, Naledi still forces us to reconsider our assumptions. Bodies ended up in extremely difficult to access cave chambers. This required planning, coordination, navigational skills, the ability to operate in complete darkness or with controlled fire, the willingness to transport bodies through dangerous passages for reasons we don't fully understand. None of this is simple behavior. None of this looks like what we'd expect from a species with a brain the size of an orange, yet Naledi was doing it. Which means either our models of cognition are incomplete, or brain size is less important than we thought, or Naledi had cognitive capabilities that its brain size doesn't predict. This connects to a broader question in evolutionary biology. How does intelligence evolve? Is it always through brain expansion, through adding more neurons and more processing power? Or can intelligence emerge through reorganization, through changing how existing neurons are connected and used? Homo naledi's brain structure suggests the latter might be possible. Small brain, but organized along Homo lines rather than Australopithecine lines. Same basic parts, but different proportions and arrangements. Maybe this reorganization allowed cognitive capabilities beyond what pure brain size would predict. There's some support for this idea from neuroscience. Brain size correlates with intelligence across species, but the correlation isn't perfect. Some large-brained animals like elephants and whales aren't as cognitively flexible as smaller-brained species like corvids or parrots. Intelligence depends on multiple factors. Total number of neurons, yes, but also neuron density, white matter organization, the ratio of different brain regions, the efficiency of neural processing. A small brain that's sufficiently organized might outperform a larger brain that's less efficiently structured. This raises fascinating possibilities. Maybe there are multiple evolutionary pathways to intelligence. The human pathway involved massive brain expansion, 3 times larger than our Australopithecine ancestors, requiring enormous metabolic investment and major changes to life history and diet. But maybe other lineages found different solutions. Maybe Homo naledi represents an alternative experiment. Keep the brain small to reduce metabolic costs, but reorganize it for efficiency. Maintain behavioral flexibility without the overhead of a huge brain. But it might have worked well enough for survival for hundreds of thousands of years. This connects to another big question. Why do humans have such large brains? What drove the expansion? The traditional story involves the social brain hypothesis, As early humans lived in larger and more complex social groups, individuals with better social cognition had advantages. They could navigate alliances, remember social relationships, predict others' behavior, cooperate, and compete effectively. Smarter individuals had more offspring. Their genes spread, brain size increased over generations. But this story has problems. If social complexity drives brain expansion, why don't other highly social species have human-sized brains? Elephants live in complex matriarchal societies, but have smaller brains relative to body size than humans. Wolves have intricate pack structures, but dog-sized brains. Cetaceans have sophisticated social systems, but while their brains are large, they're not organized like human brains. Something else about human evolution drove our particular trajectory toward enormous brains. Homo naledi complicates this story further. If Naledi was engaging in complex behaviors, like body transport and possibly burial, it was doing so with a small brain. This suggests that at least some level of social and cognitive complexity doesn't require large brains. Maybe the human brain expansion was driven by factors specific to our lineage. Dietary changes allowing us to afford the metabolic costs. Ecological pressures requiring cognitive flexibility in unpredictable environments. Cultural evolution, creating positive feedback loops where innovations demanded more brain power, which enabled more innovations. Whatever the specific factors, they apparently weren't operating on Naledi. It took a different path. Small brain, human-like organization, adequate behavioral complexity for its niche. Another big question. How many human species coexisted? We know the answer is more than we used to think. Homo sapiens emerging in East Africa. Homo naledi in South Africa. Possibly, Homo heidelbergensis still around in some regions. Europe and Asia had their own species. Neanderthals in Western Eurasia. Denisovans in Central and Eastern Asia. Homo erectus might have persisted in some isolated regions. Homo floresiensis in Indonesia. The Middle Pleistocene was a crowded time for the human family tree. Multiple species, overlapping ranges, potentially interacting or competing, or simply coexisting in different ecological niches. This diversity challenges the old narrative of linear human evolution. The idea that one species gave rise to the next in a neat succession from primitive to advanced. That story is wrong. Human evolution was bushy, not linear. Multiple lineages existing simultaneously, experimenting with different anatomical and behavioral solutions to similar challenges. Most of these experiments failed. The lineages went extinct. But for a time, Earth hosted a remarkable diversity of human-like species. And we're just starting to appreciate how diverse that radiation was. Homo naledi adds to this picture. It shows us that even 300,000 years ago, even when large-brained species like early Homo sapiens were emerging, small-brained archaic species were still viable, still surviving, still potentially doing interesting and complex things. The Middle Pleistocene wasn't just a time of progress toward modernity. It was a time of coexistence between very different human forms, and we don't know how or if these species interacted. Did Homo sapiens and Homo naledi ever meet? They overlapped in time and potentially in space. Early Homo sapiens appeared around 300,000 years ago in Africa. Homo naledi dates to between 335 and 236,000 years ago. There's overlap. Both species were in southern Africa. The Rising Star Cave System is in the cradle of humankind, a region rich with hominin fossils spanning millions of years. If both species were using this landscape, they might have encountered each other, seen each other from a distance, maybe even interacted. What would that interaction have looked like? Modern humans meeting a species with a tiny brain but human-like body? Would they have recognized Naledi as similar to themselves? Or would Naledi have seemed alien, more like clever apes than human relatives? Would there have been conflict? Competition for resources? Or avoidance? Different species occupying different niches and largely ignoring each other? We have no evidence to answer these questions. No sites showing clear evidence of interaction. No bones bearing marks of violence between species. Just the tantalizing possibility that these meetings might have occurred. There's one more big question that Homo naledi raises. How much diversity have we missed? How many other human species existed that we simply haven't found yet? The fossil record is incredibly sparse. Most organisms don't fossilize. Most fossils are never found. Most regions of Africa and Eurasia are undersampled or not sampled at all. For every species we've discovered, how many are still out there waiting to be found, or how many went extinct without leaving any fossils we'll ever discover? Homo naledi was found by accident. Two recreational cavers squeezing through a crack they'd explored hundreds of times before, but never quite gone far enough into. If they hadn't made that particular journey on that particular day, Naledi might still be undiscovered. The fossils would still be in that dark chamber, unknown to science. How many other chambers in how many other caves contain fossils of unknown species? How many open-air sites are buried under meters of sediment or have eroded away completely? How many species lived in regions that have since been subducted by tectonic processes or covered by ocean or glaciers? We're looking at Earth's past through a keyhole. We see fragments, glimpses, tiny samples of what actually existed. And from these fragments, we're trying to reconstruct the whole picture. It's remarkable that we've learned as much as we have. But we need to maintain humility about how much we don't know. Every major fossil discovery, from Australopithecus to Homo floresiensis to Homo naledi, has surprised us, has revealed diversity we didn't expect, has complicated stories we thought were settled. This pattern will continue. More species will be found. More surprises will emerge. The human family tree will keep growing more branches. And that brings us back to the fundamental question. What does it mean to be human? Maybe the question is wrong. Maybe there isn't a single set of traits that defines humanity. Maybe being human has meant different things at different times. Homo erectus was human in one way, Neanderthals in another, Homo sapiens in yet another. And Homo naledi, if it really was engaging in complex mortuary practices with a tiny brain, was human in its own unique way, different from us, different from other extinct species, but still part of the human family, still worthy of being called human, even if it doesn't match our preconceptions. This perspective is both humbling and fascinating. Humbling because it means we're not as special as we thought, not the culmination of evolution, not the inevitable endpoint of progress, just one lineage among many, successful in our own way, but not inherently superior to others. Fascinating because it means human evolution was more creative and diverse than we imagined, more willing to experiment, more likely to produce strange combinations of traits that challenge our categories and force us to think harder about what's possible. Homo naledi embodies this diversity. Surviving for hundreds of thousands of years in challenging environments alongside other human species, eventually going extinct for reasons we don't understand, but successful while it lasted. It's a reminder that evolution doesn't aim for perfection or progress. It just produces variations, and some variations survive longer than others. Ours has worked so far, but we're all part of the same grand experiment, the same evolutionary process, generating diversity, testing possibilities, creating the remarkable panorama of human forms that once inhabited this planet. And maybe that's the real lesson from Homo naledi. Not whether it buried its dead or made engravings or used fire. Those are important questions, certainly. But the bigger lesson is about diversity itself, about the many ways of being human, about the experiments that failed and the questions we can't answer and the mysteries that remain even after decades of study. Homo naledi keeps surprising us, keeps refusing to fit our expectations, keeps reminding us that human evolution was stranger and more wonderful than our linear narratives suggest. And maybe that's exactly what we need. A species that challenges our assumptions, that forces us to think harder, that shows us there's still so much we don't understand about where we came from and what we are. So we've come to the end of our journey through the mystery of Homo naledi. We've descended into the darkness. We've examined bones and brains and sediments. We've explored controversies and debates. We've considered what this strange, small-brained species might mean for human evolution. But as with all good mysteries, the ending doesn't provide all the answers. Instead, it leaves us with more questions, deeper mysteries, gaps in our understanding that might never be filled. Let's catalogue what we don't know, because honestly, the list is longer than what we do know, and that's not a failure. That's the nature of studying extinct species from fragmentary evidence, 300,000 years old. Every answer raises new questions. Every discovery reveals new mysteries. That's what makes this work compelling and humbling. Start with the most basic question. Where did Homo naledi come from? We know it existed between 335 and 236,000 years ago, based on the dated fossils. But we don't know when it first appeared. The fossils give us a snapshot of when it was alive, not when it originated. Species don't just pop into existence, they evolve from ancestral populations over time. Somewhere back in the past, there was a population of some earlier hominin species that gave rise to Naledi. The anatomy provides some clues. The mixture of primitive and modern features suggests Naledi branched off from other Homo species relatively early. Maybe around 2 million years ago, when the genus Homo was first diversifying. Maybe from populations of Homo habilis or Homo erectus that made their way to southern Africa and evolved in isolation. The small brain size, the primitive shoulder and pelvis structures, the Australopithecine-like features all point to an early divergence. But the modern hands and feet and some skull features suggest possible connections to later species. It's confusing. The mosaic anatomy doesn't give a clear answer. Genetic analysis would solve this. If we could extract and sequence Naledi DNA, we could determine exactly where it fits on the human family tree. We could see which other species it's most closely related to. We could estimate when it diverged from our lineage. We could even potentially determine if there was any gene flow between Naledi and other species through interbreeding. But DNA doesn't preserve in African caves. The heat and moisture destroy organic molecules too quickly. Despite multiple attempts by different labs, no Naledi DNA has been recovered. Without genetics, we're stuck with anatomical comparisons and educated guesses. The best current hypothesis, and it's truly just a hypothesis, is that Naledi represents an early diverging Homo lineage that split off around 2 million years ago and then persisted in southern Africa for over 1 million years. Isolated populations evolving their own unique characteristics, while the rest of the human family tree was branching and diversifying across Africa and beyond. This would explain the mixture of primitive and modern features, some traits retained from ancient ancestors. Others evolved independently. The whole package creating something unique that doesn't fit neatly into our classification schemes. But we don't know this for certain. Maybe Naledi appeared much more recently. Maybe it descended from a larger-brained species that evolved smaller brains as an adaptation to resource-limited environments. Island dwarfing happens. Species that colonize islands often evolve smaller body sizes because islands have limited resources. Maybe something similar happened with Naledi in isolated southern African refugia, large-brained ancestors arriving, then shrinking over generations as selection favored smaller, more efficient body and brain sizes. Without more fossils from different time periods, we can't trace Naledi's evolutionary trajectory. We also don't know how widespread Naledi was. All known fossils come from one cave system, the Rising Star Caves in South Africa. That's it. We don't know if Naledi lived across southern Africa, or across all of Africa, or if it was confined to a small region around Rising Star. Finding fossils in one location doesn't tell you about geographic range. Maybe Naledi was common across a large region, and we've just been lucky to find one population. Maybe it was restricted to a small area because it was outcompeted by other species everywhere else. Maybe it was nomadic, and the Rising Star Chambers just happened to be a culturally important site that groups returned to for generations. This uncertainty about geographic range connects to questions about population, size, and ecology. How many Naledi individuals existed at any given time? Dozens? Thousands? Tens of thousands? Small populations face higher extinction risk through inbreeding, disease, environmental fluctuations. Large populations are more resilient, but require more resources and territory. We have no way of estimating Naledi population size from the fossils we've found. The 18 individuals from Rising Star could represent a single extended family group or a tiny sample from a much larger population. Without fossils from multiple sites, we can't assess population structure or demographics. What did Naledi eat? This should be answerable from dental, microwear, chemical signatures in teeth, and comparison with other species. And researchers have done these analyses. The results suggest a varied diet. The teeth show wear consistent with eating hard and abrasive foods occasionally. Not constantly, like specialized grass eaters, but regularly. The small tooth size and gracile jaws suggest overall a high-quality diet without massive amounts of tough plant material requiring extensive chewing. Maybe fruits, tubers, nuts, possibly meat. An omnivorous diet using a variety of resources, but we don't have direct evidence. No food remains associated with Naledi, no sites showing what they were eating, no preserved stomach contents or coprolites. We're inferring diet from toothwear and anatomy, which gives general patterns but not specifics. Did Naledi hunt, scavenge, focus on plant foods, use tools for food processing? We don't know. The hand anatomy suggests tool capability, but no tools have been found. The foot anatomy suggests ranging behavior, but we don't know what they were ranging for. The mysteries of Naledi's daily life remain opaque. What about predators and threats? Did Naledi face predation pressure from large carnivores? Southern Africa, 300,000 years ago, had plenty of dangerous animals. Lions, leopards, hyenas, saber-toothed cats. Any of these could have preyed on small-bodied 90-pound hominins. Maybe Naledi's climbing ability was partly for predator avoidance, climbing trees when threatened, sleeping in trees at night, using caves as refuges. The rising star chambers might have been attractive, partly because they were safe from predators, too difficult for large carnivores to access. But again, we're speculating. We have no evidence of predation, no Naledi bones bearing carnivore damage, no evidence of how Naledi dealt with predator threats, or what role predation played in Naledi evolution and behavior. It's all inference and guesswork. When did Homo naledi go extinct? We know it was alive 236,000 years ago at minimum. The youngest dated fossils are that old. But that doesn't tell us when it disappeared. Maybe it went extinct soon after. Maybe it persisted for another 100,000 years, leaving no fossils that we've found. Maybe it survived until 50,000 years ago, when modern humans were spreading across Africa. We simply don't know. The latest fossils give us a minimum age but not an extinction date. This is frustrating because the timing of extinction might tell us something about why Naledi disappeared. If it went extinct around 200,000 years ago, when Homo sapiens was emerging and spreading, maybe there's a connection. Maybe competition with modern humans drove Naledi to extinction. Maybe interbreeding absorbed Naledi populations into the sapiens gene pool. Maybe environmental changes around that time stressed Naledi populations beyond their capacity to survive. Or maybe extinction came much later, driven by completely different factors. Without knowing when it happened, we can't investigate why. Why were there no stone tools in the rising star caves? This absence is genuinely puzzling. If Naledi had the hand anatomy for tool manufacture, if it was navigating into deep caves and possibly engaging in complex behaviors like burial, tools should be present. Other human species from this time period were making sophisticated stone tools. Acheulean hand axes, prepared core technologies, systematic blade production. Stone tools are everywhere in Middle Pleistocene sites, except in the Naledi chambers. Why? Maybe Naledi used tools made from perishable materials exclusively. Wood, bone, plant fibers. These don't preserve in most contexts. Modern chimpanzees use wooden tools extensively. Termite fishing sticks, leaf sponges, grass probes. Maybe Naledi had similar behaviors, using organic tools that left no archaeological trace. This would explain the absence of stone tools, while still allowing for tool use consistent with the hand anatomy. Or maybe Naledi did make stone tools but not in caves. Maybe the caves were special locations used only for body disposal, and tool use happened elsewhere in the landscape. The Stone Age archaeological record comes primarily from open-air sites near resources like water sources or game trails. If Naledi was living and working in different locations from where its fossils end up, we wouldn't find tools and bones together. This seems plausible but also convenient. It explains the absence without requiring evidence. Or, and this is the uncomfortable possibility, maybe Naledi wasn't making stone tools at all despite having capable hands. Maybe the cognitive requirements for systematic stone tool manufacture are higher than the anatomical requirements. You need not just dexterous hands, but also planning, sequencing, understanding of fracture mechanics, teaching, and learning social structures. Maybe Naledi's small brain, despite its human-like organization, just wasn't up to the task. If this is true, it would be humbling. It would mean hands alone aren't sufficient for tool manufacture. That cognition matters more than anatomy for complex technology. That Homo naledi, despite tool-capable anatomy, might have been cognitively limited in ways that prevented systematic tool-making. Pick up sticks, crack nuts with stones, use simple, expedient tools, but systematic manufacture creating recognizable tool types? Maybe not. This connects to the burial controversy. If Naledi wasn't cognitively capable of stone tool manufacture, was it capable of symbolic mortuary behavior? The two domains might require different cognitive processes. Social cognition for burial behavior, technical cognition for tool making. Maybe Naledi had one, but not the other. Or maybe the absence of tools suggests the absence of both. Maybe the burial hypothesis is wrong precisely because the tool evidence suggests cognitive limitations that would preclude symbolic behavior. We don't know. We're speculating based on absence, which is always dangerous. Maybe tomorrow, someone will find a Naledi site full of stone tools and the whole picture will change. Maybe the caves are just unusual contexts where tools weren't needed or brought. Maybe Naledi tool use was present but rare, falling below the threshold of archaeological visibility. Every scenario is possible. None is proven. Here's another mystery. Did Homo naledi interact with other human species? We know Naledi lived at the same time as early Homo sapiens and possibly late Homo heidelbergensis. Did these species meet? Compete? Interbreed? Coexist peacefully in different ecological niches? We have no evidence of interaction. No sites showing mixed faunas. No bones bearing marks of interspecies conflict. No genetic evidence of hybridization, though that's because we don't have Naledi DNA to test. The silence might mean species never met, or it might just mean we haven't found the evidence yet. Modern human evolution is full of species interactions. We interbred with Neanderthals and Denisovans. These encounters left genetic signatures visible in living humans today. Non-African populations carry 1 to 3% Neanderthal DNA. Some Asian populations carry Denisovan DNA. These hybridization events happened relatively recently, within the last 100,000 years. Could Homo sapiens have hybridized with Homo naledi 200 or 300,000 years ago? If so, those genetic signatures would be much harder to detect. More ancient introgression events are diluted by subsequent evolution and harder to distinguish from background variation. Without Naledi DNA, we can't test for hybridization. We can't determine if gene flow occurred between species. We can't even confirm that Naledi and sapiens belonged to species separate enough that hybridization would have been difficult. Maybe they could interbreed easily. Maybe they couldn't at all. Maybe they tried and produced infertile offspring. All possibilities, none testable with current evidence. And then there's the big mystery, the one that started this whole journey. Even if the burial hypothesis is wrong, even if the features aren't deliberate graves, bodies still ended up in extremely difficult to access chambers. Multiple bodies, multiple chambers. Repeatedly over time, some behavioral explanation is required. What was it? Maybe mortuary caching, removal of bodies from living areas to prevent disease spread or predator attraction. But caching usually means placing bodies somewhere accessible, where you can return to defend the cache or retrieve items if needed. Deep, inaccessible caves aren't good caches. Too difficult to reach, too hard to defend. Why go to such effort? Maybe the caves had cultural significance. Naledi groups developed traditions around body disposal. Elders dying, young individuals told they must take the body to the sacred cave. It becomes self-reinforcing. The cave is important because ancestors are there. New bodies go there because it's where ancestors are. A cultural practice perpetuating itself through generations. This requires symbolic thought, but maybe not full burial behavior. Simple cultural transmission, without elaborate belief systems about death and afterlife. Or maybe there's an explanation we haven't thought of. Some aspect of Naledi behavior or ecology that made deep caves attractive for reasons we can't reconstruct from current evidence. Maybe caves were cool refuges where bodies could be stored during hot seasons. Maybe darkness itself had significance. Maybe the journey into the cave was a rite of passage for young individuals, and carrying bodies was how they proved themselves. The possibilities are limited only by imagination, and without more evidence, imagination is all we have. These mysteries aren't going away. Some will be solved with future discoveries. More fossils from different locations. Tools finally associated with Naledi. DNA successfully extracted and sequenced. Better dating methods applied to cave sediments and features. Comparative studies with other species, providing context. Science will continue. The Rising Star team will publish more analyses. Other researchers will excavate other sites. Gradually, slowly, some questions will be answered, but some mysteries might be permanent. Some questions might never have answers because the evidence is gone. Destroyed by time, by geological processes, by the sheer improbability of preservation over hundreds of thousands of years. We're looking at deep time through fragments, glimpses, tiny samples of what actually happened. We're extraordinarily lucky to have what we have, but we also need to accept that some things are simply unknowable, and maybe that's okay. Maybe the mysteries are part of the story. Maybe Homo naledi's purpose in the grand narrative of human evolution isn't to provide answers but to provoke questions, to challenge our assumptions about brains and behavior, to force us to think harder about what's possible, to remind us that our family tree was diverse and strange and full of experiments we're only beginning to discover, to keep us humble about how much we don't know and how much remains to be found. So here we are, at the end of this long exploration. Homo naledi remains mysterious. A species out of time with a brain too small and behaviors too complex. Bodies in dark caves for reasons we can't quite determine. Hands that could make tools but didn't. Or did, but we haven't found them. Feet that walked like ours attached to a body that climbed like an ape. If you've made it this far, through all these chapters, through caves and controversies and scientific debates, maybe you're falling asleep now. That's what these videos are for. But as you drift off, think about this. Somewhere deep in the earth beneath South Africa, there are bones. Bones of creatures that walked on two legs 300,000 years ago, that navigated in darkness or with fire, that carried their dead into the deepest chambers and left them there for reasons we may never fully understand. Those bones waited hundreds of thousands of years in silent darkness, until two cavers squeezed through a crack and shone a light on them. And now we know. We know Homo naledi existed. We know it was strange and contradictory and doesn't fit our models. We know it challenges our assumptions and forces us to think differently about human evolution. We know some things about how it looked and where it lived and what its anatomy could do. But mostly we know how much we don't know. How many mysteries remain? How many questions still need asking? That's the real story. Not the burial debates or the brain size controversies. Not the arguments about sediments and fire traces. The real story is that our past is vast and strange and mostly hidden from us. That every time we think we understand human evolution, we find something like Homo naledi that doesn't make sense. That forces us to revise and rethink and admit uncertainty. The real story is that the search continues. The mysteries remain. And somewhere out there, in caves we haven't explored or sediments we haven't excavated, there are more species waiting to be discovered. More surprises waiting to challenge everything we thought we knew. Sleep well. Dream of deep caves and small brains, and the many ways of being human. The story isn't over. It never is. There's always more to discover. Always deeper mysteries. Always another cave system waiting for someone brave enough and small enough to squeeze through impossible gaps and shine a light into the darkness. That's how science works. One discovery at a time, one mystery at a time, one species at a time. And Homo Naledi, strange and controversial and endlessly fascinating, is just one more chapter in a story we're still writing, a story that began millions of years ago and continues today, a story about where we came from and what we are, and all the strange experiments that evolution tried along the way. Some of those experiments led to us, and somewhere in the darkness, there are stories we haven't even imagined yet. Waiting, always waiting.